Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the UCD School of Agriculture and Food Science Symposium this afternoon on rethinking the food system. It's great to see lots of participants on our call. I hope you enjoy this afternoon. You can contribute to the symposium on Twitter at UCD Ag Food. You can see that up there behind me. And using the hashtag UCD Food Systems. Unfortunately, circumstances prevent us from having this event on campus this year, but consistent with previous years, there's great interest. We're expecting over 400 participants this afternoon from a diverse range of interests and also places, including some attendees from outside Ireland. So a very warm welcome to you. I don't have to tell you where the fire exits are today, and I hope you know where your nearest toilet is. There is a short break planned this afternoon, but nonetheless, I hope you enjoy the lineup of speakers and the discussion this afternoon. The title of the symposium is Rethinking the Food System, and this is highly relevant to the challenges that our food systems are facing at the moment. Society is more aware of how food is produced and are demanding more and more sophisticated food and health solutions with environmental, sustainability, and societal challenges becoming more and more relevant. There's a strong focus on the importance of food for health, on understanding the effect of the food we eat, and the link between producing food and its impact on the environment, with a focus on our natural resources. Our food systems need to transform to implement measures to improve resource efficiency, to reduce our carbon footprint, to limit our effect on the environment and the impact of the resources we use. However, we also need to increase the health of our society at the same time as addressing this rapid growth in the demand for food. Personally, I don't see a major swing away from the foods that we eat today. But in the future, I do see a much greater variety of foods being available to an increasingly choosy and demanding consumer. And I'm sure we're going to hear today about the kinds of demands that consumers will have, be they real or perceived. I foresee big changes in food production, in food provenance and food chain logistics, just to mention a few things. Today's symposium is an opportunity to hear from a range of experts who will present findings from their latest research and discuss how these findings can contribute to a better understanding of the transformations needed to provide sustainable solutions for the sufficient supply of healthy foods from food production all the way through to human nutrition, and not forgetting the environment. The speakers today reflect a nice mix of people from the school, from UCD, and from the international community of experts. They reflect the broad range of research and teaching that is covered in the School of Agriculture and Food Science, and we're looking forward to learning from them today. Before we move to the first session, I would like to give a few words of thanks. The symposium is the work of our School Research, Innovation and Impact Committee and a team that was led by Professor Lorraine Brennan. Lorraine, thanks very much to you and your colleagues there. Thanks also to Niamh McLaughlin, Patricia Tuffy, Valerie Abbott, Damien Dempsey, and also our wider symposium support team for making it all happen. A big thanks also to our sponsors, who are the Environmental Protection Agency Ireland, the EPA, and also the UCD Institute of Food and Health. I also thank the speakers and the panel members for their participation and the work they have put into preparing for this afternoon's session. I know it's not trivial, and I also know that it's often not easy doing this in a virtual environment. Oftentimes it's much easier in front of a live audience. So a big thank you to you. Thanks to you, the audience, who have tuned in today. I encourage you to ask questions. Use the Q&A option on the right of your screen. When a question occurs to you, just type it in there and we'll save those up and try and get them answered at the end of each session where we have scheduled time to answer those questions. So again, don't forget to tweet at UCDAgFood and use the hashtag UCDFoodSystems. So that's enough for me. Our first session is the challenge facing our food systems, and it's going to be chaired by Dr. Afric O'Sullivan. Afric is Assistant Professor in Human Nutrition and also Associate Dean for Internationalization in the School of Agriculture and Food Science. Afric, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Delighted to chair this first session on the challenge facing our food system. And I suppose, so as not to delay, I'm going to jump straight in and introduce our first speaker, Professor Fiona Doohan. So Fiona is Professor of Plant Health in the UCD School of Biology and Environmental Science. And her research is focused on developing environmentally sustainable means of increasing Irish plant protein. She's also a co-founder of eSeed, which is a company that develops biologicals for enhancing crop productivity, and is a member of the scientific board of the Global Wheat Initiative. So I'll hand over to Professor Doohan now, who's going to talk about our food system, the renewed role for plants.
Thanks very much, Afric, and thanks to Afric and Lorraine and the team in UCD for the invitation to speak here today. We all know that meat and dairy are a very, very important component of the Irish diet, and it will remain, and they will remain so. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I see as the future for plant-based food production systems in Ireland, and indeed food and feed. So I'm a crop scientist, and coming at it from a crop scientist point of view, I'm going to start with the take-home messages. So I'll jump to the conclusion, and there's 3 take-home messages. And the first is, as most people are aware, there's a growing and renewed focus on crops in the human diet and in sustainable farming systems. So the global dietary shift is moving towards more flexitarians, people who opt for meat occasionally rather than every day, on development of hybrid products, dairy, plant hybrid products, for example. There's an increase in vegan and vegetarian diets as well. So we're all aware of the global shift. And just to tell you that the primary source of these plant-based calories are, so what crops, what plants are people eating? There's obviously fruit and vegetables and nuts. And then a major part of the diet currently, if you think about your bread and your pasta, etc., comprises small and large grain cereals, maize, wheat, barley, oats, rye, and legumes. So soybean is a very, very important component of alternative meat products, but there's also other legumes, chickpea, pea, bean, lentil, etc., which are very important in the human diet. So there's increased consumption of plant-based products, and so that obviously means there's an increased demand for tillage and horticultural produce. So that's great on a global stage, on an EU stage, and indeed on a national stage. There are some downsides at the moment for Ireland, and there's 2 of them. And the first is that we as a nation score low on the security of our plant-based food and indeed our plant-based feed supply systems. And secondly, we have optimized our current crop production systems for conventional high intensity or high input production systems. So just to look at that in terms of how our systems are low in terms of crop and horticultural production in Ireland. And just taking these numbers from the CSO, from the Central Statistics Office, looking at our production of cereals and potatoes here, looking at the 2020 numbers, we see that the acreage here is very low, the 1,000 hectares, and there's relatively stable, a small decrease in 2020 in wheat, offset by an increase in barley. Overall in 2020, there was a small decrease in cereals, and that's offset by an increase in cattle production in terms of acreage. So we have relatively low crop production in Ireland. And then if we look at, well, what are we importing into the country and what are we exporting at the crop level? And this is just looking at some of the trends and just taking some of the major staple foods and looking in terms of monetary value in million US dollars. We see that we're increasing significant amounts of vegetables, of wheat flour, of edible nuts and peels, etc. And at the same time, we're actually exporting relatively little. So we're a net importer of huge amounts of plant-based produce, is the take-home message. The second drawback at the moment for Ireland, as I've said, is that we have optimized our systems, as many European counterparts and global counterparts have done, for relatively high input systems. And if you look at the OEC table and for pesticide usage, and that's what you're looking at here, don't worry about the detail, just look at the red line down below, that's Ireland, the red circle. It looks as if we're relatively low, and that's over a larger agricultural land acreage, but actually for crops such as cereal, etc., we're actually quite high in terms of pesticides. But the major issue is we're facing huge challenges as we move forward towards reduced input agricultural systems. So, for example, glyphosate is always coming up every 5 years. Will it have a renewed license in the EU? Luxembourg, for example, will be the first country to totally ban glyphosate this year, by the end of this year. So, you know, I think the time is ticking for glyphosate. And then in the recent Chagas research autumn report, Ewan and his colleagues there highlighted how, looking forward to the Green Deal and the special issue on the Green Deal, we have to diversify our crop-based products, and we have to increase our integrated pest management in order to comply and reduce pesticide usage in farms and to be compliant with where we're going in the Green Deal. So, okay, that's threats, that's the negative side, but there's also opportunities. So yes, we have to deal with greenhouse gases, and there are issues with greenhouse gas emissions with crop production. There's lots of EU legislation to deal with, the Biodiversity Directive, there's Brexit, there's changing diets. You can look at that as a negative, but you can also look at it as a positive. So I'd like to be the optimist here and go with the first part of Winston Churchill's quote and saying an optimist sees an opportunity in every calamity rather than the other way around. So I think there is opportunity for Ireland, and I think actually we're at a really important point in our decision-making process in terms of what we're going to do, how we're going to develop our agricultural systems. And, you know, crops is, I'm a tillage scientist, I would say, but, you know, crops as a whole is, and it's very important to remember that, it's horticulture, tillage, and also we have the forestry sector. And all three are very, very important in terms for the national economy. But recently, just to highlight one thing that was released, the Crops 2030 report, which summarised some of the threats and opportunities in the relative market sectors. And then we can look at, just on December the 1st there, France made a big announcement that they were going to regain food sovereignty by boosting by 40% their production of protein crops, and particularly looking at soybean, and then doubling protein crop production over the next 10 years thereafter. So should we follow France? Should we have policies and directives to really drive an increase in the production of protein crops in Ireland? Why are they doing this? They're seeing the increased market in meat alternatives. They want to feed that market with their own indigenous plant-based material. They want to reduce imports from South America, for example, of soybean. And so they're really looking at that in a very concerted way across the whole food chain. So I think it's time for some systemic innovation in Irish plant production systems built on two premises, built on nutritional value and health benefits of what we're delivering for human food, but also for animal feed, and built on sustainability. And a fact that many people who don't work in my little world of sort of crop science and plant breeding don't realise is that nutrition is very low down on the scale when people are breeding for new crop varieties. The key demand is high yield, and thereafter factors such as disease resistance. Nutrition is not a key parameter. And as several research projects have shown around the world, including one from Bill and Melinda Gates, that a number of nutritional interventions can significantly improve health, including child health and survival, and that includes breeding crops for improved nutritional content. And I think you will see a major shift towards this in a systems-based agriculture of the future, and we should be looking at that in Ireland at the moment. And obviously sustainability. Sustainability at farm level in terms of a living wage, for farmers, and incentives, and looking at tools to evaluate this economic sustainability. There's obviously environmental sustainability in terms of reduced greenhouse gases, reduced pesticides, reduced fertilizers, more targeted uptake of fertilizers, and improved soil health. And a very important part of sustainability, and we often forget there's 3 pillars to sustainability, and the third is social sustainability. And to really drive change here and to really position Ireland to benefit from the change that is happening now and in the EU and globally, we need to develop these communities of practice and really look at the supply chain, both short and long. And we need to underpin the sustainability by digital systems such as track and trace systems and smart decision support systems across the chain, and I mean from soil to health and back. And now I'm just going to focus for a few minutes on the example of oats. So oats was a crop that was cultivated widely in Ireland in the past, and obviously its production has decreased over the last 30 to 40 years. Again, it's on the increase slightly. It's a crop with great potential. We can produce high quality indigenous oat products. It's an ideal low input crop. It's proven health benefits. It has compounds such as vitamin E, oils, beta glucans, etc. And it's been linked to decreases, consumption of oats has been linked to decreases in non-communicable diseases and cancers. So, and there's loads of potential to develop new products, including hybrid products. We only have to look to our Northern European colleagues and we see that there are lots of products that they have developed from oats and great potential there. So I just want to tell you about one new project that we're very excited in UCD and in Teagasc in Ireland. We've just found out that we have received funding just under 3 million, 2.7 million for a new oat project from the EU Interreg Wales Ireland programme. And we're going to look at improving the genetic diversity of oats because unfortunately we grow a very narrow range of oat varieties in Ireland. I'll come back to why diversity is important. Improve disease resistance and varieties that will improve the biological balance of farm soils and a farm level. Obviously looking at greenhouse gas emissions and minimizing that in terms of fertilizer input, looking at mycotoxin contamination. So mycotoxins are toxins that fungal diseases can produce in oats. So we want to make sure that we choose varieties and oat production systems that minimize the level of toxins in food. And we really want to look at nutritionally enhancing the oat products and developing new oat products within that project. And the key points in that, and indeed you could apply this to any new plant-based system in Ireland, is that, and obviously at pre-farm gate level here, biodiversity is important, breeding is important. Breeding is not new, breeding has been going on for eras, but it's a new era now in terms of breeding. We're not just looking at yield, we have to be looking at nutrition, disease resistance, and performance under low input management regimes. Raw materials such as oats have problems in terms of anti-nutritionals, compounds that inhibit the bioavailability of certain nutrients. We have to look to see can we breed, and indeed you can breed, to reduce the level of those compounds. And we have to breed for healthy soil biomes. And it really has to be a systems-based approach for any plant-based system in Ireland, looking at from health back to soil. So what's the products we need and how can we produce those in a sustainable way? And what can we produce and what can we develop from those that has great health impacts, both for the national market, but also for the export market. And I just want to give you an example of how crop biodiversity is important. So don't worry too much about the detail of this. Every dot here is a different variety of oats. And we tested these varieties in the field, so that's the y-axis, and in the glasshouse for their level of mycotoxin. So we contaminated them with the fungus that produces mycotoxin, and we said, are there varieties that even though we shove loads of this fungus on them, they only develop or harbor low levels of these harmful mycotoxins. And you see there in the red circle, what I'm pointing out there is our oat varieties that performed well in the glasshouse studies and in field studies in terms of they only harbored low levels of these mycotoxins, despite the fact that they had the potential to develop the same amount as any other variety. So crop biodiversity is important, not just for yield, but even for food safety. And obviously now we're going on to look at nutrition. And then moving to future farms in Europe, I just like to show, here's a picture from a trial that Tom McCabe and UCD Lions and I are doing as part of an EU project, Innovar, looking at high performance, low risk varieties. And we're growing loads of different varieties and saying, are there varieties, and in this case it's wheat, that can perform very well under reduced inputs? So can we adapt the varieties? Can we harness biodiversity to enhance our ability to produce crops under low input systems? But for plant breeding, it's not just the plant that's important. And as Afrik said at the beginning, I work on microbes. They're endophytes, they're special little bugs that live inside plants. And we have done quite a lot of work on them and their potential to enhance crop productivity. And just show you two examples here. This is an example of barley plants that are drought stressed. On the left, you have plants that are drought stressed where we didn't add an endophyte seed treatment. And on the right, the same level of drought stress. The only difference is these seed of the same variety as on the left were treated with an endophyte. So there's great potential to use microbial diversity to enhance food security and crop productivity in Ireland and beyond. There's loads of new exciting projects in plant-based proteins. I just named some there. The Green Deal, Disruptive Technologies. DAFM has funded several exciting projects in this area recently. Science Foundation Ireland, industry-led, and UCD we have the Origin Enterprises SFI Constance project, etc. There's lots of potential, but there is a need at a national level for a more concerted focus on plant innovation across horticulture, tillage and forestry, and looking at our current production systems, low inputs, regenerative farming, and particularly focused obviously on rotations and intercropping in those systems. And that's why recently we have launched Plant Eye as a component of a larger project on food integrity that we've been looking across the island of Ireland. And we're looking at the sustainability, the diversification, and the production of higher value products from plants. And that's a really exciting development that will take off now in the next year. So to conclude, there's huge opportunity to develop the Irish plant-based economy. We're at a crux now in terms of where we are. There's loads of calamities, but in calamity there's opportunity. And I think the major opportunity is if we sit back and really plan and develop a systemic approach that has a circular bioeconomy approach and a national agenda for plant innovation. And I mentioned there the Plant Innovation Hub. So I'll finish up there. I just want to thank many collaborators. I named some of the ones we've collaborated with recently and funding bodies that have enabled us to conduct our research to date. Thanks, Afrik.
Thanks, Fiona, for an excellent presentation. Really interesting. Particularly interesting there what you mentioned about the changing the microbiota and the impact that has on plant growth. I suppose I'm just interested in that from a nutrition perspective as well. What I might do first is go to the questions and answers. So we've got a couple of questions coming in. So the first question here, just firstly to thank you for your talk as well. But also then asking your opinion on the role of ruminants in tillage production systems in terms of grazing of cover crops by livestock to support soil organic matter content of tillage soils.
Yeah, so this brings me back to an area that I'm particularly interested in, which is the regenerative farming. And I think there's a major role of sort of integrated regenerative farm systems. So I think absolutely, and cover crops is actually an area as well where we're starting to make inroads to some new exciting developments in that and research in different institutions across the island. But certainly I think they have a role, and I think we have to value what we have, you know, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, you know, and we try and integrate the systems, and that's what will give us sustainable systems that improve soil quality.
Great, thanks, Fiona. Another question coming through here. So what do you think the new legislation on pesticides will mean for farmers?
It's very significant, and actually, you know, there are some new products coming down the line. We can see that through research that's being done nationally and internationally, but there are significant changes. I think in terms of the biodiversity directive, there's changes, but also in terms of the Green Deal. And so I think it is time to really, it goes back to the point I said, yes, there is a change there for farmers, absolutely, but we need to look at the system as a whole again. We are not breeders of crops, unfortunately, on the island. We take from other countries. The exception is, I have to say, is potatoes. But, you know, maybe we need to look much more holistically at our whole system again in order to serve farmers better. I don't think we're doing the best for farmers that we could do in that regard.
Great. Another question coming in here. What is your opinion on the role of neglected plants, so the non-common crops, in the future in different parts of the world?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting area. And actually, one of my colleagues in UCD has developed this EU collaborative action called Diversicrop. So we don't want to, in one way, I applaud France for having this new policy and legislation around increasing protein crops. In another way, I slightly cry on the side when I see that it's a big focus on soybean. Diversity is the key of life: soil biodiversity, crop biodiversity. So I think we need to be really careful of where we go, and I think we need to value, and actually, we need to value some of our indigenous sort of crops that were very marginal but may have potential uses. I live in Donegal, and areas where you have very weird and wonderful crops, plants such as bog bean, etc., and they would be neglected, but they have huge phytochemical or medicinal value, and that's a real extreme example. But we shouldn't neglect things like that, and I think the Irish Plant Innovation Hub would be very, very adamant that we look at the potential of all crops, marginal and mainstream crops.
Great. Okay. I have another question here. Again, thanks for an excellent presentation. Do plant protein growth provide multiple advantages, such as carbon sinks?
Yes, but you need to be very careful. There's a lot of, you'll see a lot of stuff in the literature, that you can reduce greenhouse gases with crop production. It's all about the management and the decision support systems in crops. So I wouldn't give a blanket answer there. It has the potential, absolutely, but in a very carefully managed way. It can also go the other way on you, So it's really about the decision support systems and the management regimes and the intercropping and the multi-cropping. So, there's no simple answer there. I wouldn't like to answer that with a direct yes.
Brilliant, thanks. Just a final question here, kind of going back to your point on diversification of the plant crops. Sorry, these are jumping around the screen on me here. What plant crops would you consider that Ireland could be competitive at an EU level? And I suppose I might just even tag on to that. Do you see any of the kind of the marginal crops that Ireland might be unique to Ireland, maybe, as being potential crops for future production?
I wouldn't say necessarily unique to Ireland. There might be, not on a large scale at least, okay? There are smaller crops that might be unique to Ireland, but there's certainly crops, let's take the example of legumes. There's a huge increase in the use of legumes in meat alternatives, okay? Much of that is dominated by soya coming in from South America. And, so France looks to replace the soya with indigenous soya. I think there's an opportunity in Ireland to replace the soya. Every time I look at my daughter's a vegetarian, and every time I go to the supermarket and I look at the imported soya on the back of the box, so there's an opportunity to replace it with other legumes. There's a very narrow range of some legumes grown in Europe, never mind Ireland, but there's great potential for that. Field beans, for example. But I wouldn't limit it to one. I think the legumes is a really interesting area to look at, but also the quinoa and other crops that can be grown here.
Okay, and again, you've got the protein sources within those legumes and crops like that as well. So you're touching on multiple points.
We need to look at what the market needs and wants and how it can adapt the processing systems to a certain extent, what the nutritional needs are, and then go back. We need to have a market for farmers before we change things.
Yeah. Great, thanks. I think that's a good point to finish on as well. It kind of ties things up. So thanks very much, Fiona. And I'll move on now to our second speaker. So I'd like to introduce Professor Jonathan Rushton. Jonathan is a professor of animal health and food systems economics at the University of Liverpool, and he specialises in the economics of animal health and food systems. Jonathan is based in the Institute of Infection and Global Health and leads a university centre of excellence for sustainable food systems and is part of the N8 Agri-Food programme. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Rushton, and he's going to talk about the pragmatic production, efficient and resilient agriculture.
Thank you, Dashri. Yeah, so when I was given this title, I think it should probably include a question mark, and I'm going to try and go through this in a sort of rather more systematic way in terms of thinking more carefully about the drivers of the food system itself. Before I begin, there's lots of people I want to thank who are part of the people I work with in Liverpool, but also across the NA agri-food system. And I want to thank Barry McMahon for getting the invite to actually give the presentation today. A particular mention to one of my colleagues, Martin Mortimer, who sadly died last year. Martin was absolutely critical in terms of getting the idea of food security going in the University of Liverpool, and was one of the original sort of generators of the idea for the need for a centre of excellence for sustainable food systems there. What do I want to cover? Well, I want to think more carefully about the era of rapid changes that we've gone through, particularly with our food systems. Think about this sort of changing language with regards to our research programs from agriculture, which is what I grew up in, to thinking more carefully about food and food systems. And I want to think more carefully about the kind of positives and negatives that have arisen from that particular period of change, and think more carefully towards the end about what kind of challenges do we face and what should we actually be doing about those challenges. So let's start with thinking about changing human population. And if we look across the piece, these are FAO stat data, we can see a change probably about 20 years ago where actually the numbers of people in the rural space has started to sort of level off. And we've ended up with a situation where we've now got equal populations in urban and rural areas. But if we move into the future, one of the things that we're going to see is actually an increase in the urban populations in Asia and Africa. And maybe the main human population increases are going to be in these two areas of the brilliant world. What does that look like? Well, in Europe itself, we have slow growing cities, or in some cases, actually cities actually shrinking. So the redder the color, the fact that it's actually shrinking, the greener the color, the more rapidly it's changing and increasing. Moving to South America, similar sort of pattern of slow growth in the urban centers. But if we look across into China, we can see that many cities are growing still very, very rapidly. Moving to South and Southeast Asia, again, rapid growth. And across into Africa, we've got really fast growth in certain points. So we've got quite big challenges going on with regards both human population increases, but also where those people are actually found. So we place that into some kind of context where we've got this kind of rural to urban population drift. We've got two phenomena working here. This first sort of change where people move into urban centres means that we have people that still have some foothold in that rural area and still some knowledge of our local food systems. But once these people start having children in these urban areas, the next generation and the third generations truly become urbanised, and they become rather dissociated with the food systems that they're actually dependent in. Now, I think this has happened in the UK probably about 40 years ago. I still think it's in the process of transition in many parts of Ireland, which is where I'm sitting at the moment. But I think this is a real problem where a large proportion of our population will actually become dissociated with how food is produced and possibly don't even recognise what's happening in the food system at all. So what's actually happening in these food systems? Well, we still have quite a number of simple food systems where much of production, processing and consumption takes place in the family or within the household, with limited use of purchased inputs and products being sold into local markets with fairly low demands for quality issues, and obviously some movement across this in terms of money. These types of systems are still very familiar in places in Asia, Africa and certain parts of South America, but they're less dominant now in most parts of Europe and certainly in North America and certainly other rich countries. What have they been replaced with? We've pulled these systems apart. So we've actually started to separate the inputs, the producers, the processors and the marketers from the consumers. There's flows of products across those systems and flows of money back across that system. And these systems are supported by a large group of people who are middlemen, transporters and traders, and also lots of people actually providing financial services across that system. Now, my own family have moved from that simple to complex in the period little bit beyond my lifetime. So my grandpa farmed on the edge of the Pennines on the Lancastrian side. He had 13 cows and he ran a milk brand. But my father, and this is a farm system I grew up in, actually changed that, generated a herd that was 220 cows back in the 1980s. He supplied milk at a national level. Now that farm doesn't exist anymore, and there's hardly any dairy cows in that area because they've all been concentrated in certain pockets. So we've moved away from that simple to complex in the UK in a period of about 50 or 60 years. So that's been quite a fast transition, and it's still ongoing to this date. When we've done research in Africa, and this is research led by Eric Fev, with strong support from Pablo Alacon, we've actually looked more carefully at these livestock food systems in Nairobi, which again are rapidly changing, a city that's growing very fast, bringing in livestock from all over the country. But not just across the country, it's actually bringing animals in from Ethiopia, Somalia, Tanzania, Uganda. So these trade routes are actually being dominated by demand from city issues, in particular in terms of Nairobi. So what does that kind of look like overall? Well, I would sort of make analogies here of kind of upside down triangle. So we have national production, we have got overseas production. And if you look at the UK in particular, we have a system where only about 340,000 people are actually working on agricultural holdings in the UK. That's about 0.5% of our population. And yet they're actually affecting the health and well-being of 66 million people. Go back to the 1980s when we got something wrong, when we actually had a problem here in terms of BSE, mad cow disease. So there was actually an impact across a very wide number of people because of some mistakes made in that food system. So it's increasingly important that we take quite seriously how we manage that system and how we legislate it. So how are we doing that? Well, I would say we've moved fairly swiftly from a sort of farmer to consumer type focus to a kind of processor to consumer process in the 70s and 80s in the UK, to one where we've got the retailer and the catering groups actually dominating issues and actually looking for shareholder value. Now, is there a problem there? Well, we go from a cultural-led system to something that's more around government policy, to something that's actually now about private standards with some legislation providing the frameworks. In the UK, probably 2 or 3 supermarkets dominate maybe 60 to 70% of all the food supplied across that particular structure. So they have a huge responsibility in terms of managing that. And they've driven certain things. So if you think about that efficiency piece, they've been a real driver in terms of squeezing costs down at farm level and actually changing the way we do business at farm level, but also how we change agriculture itself. So what do we know about agriculture within that food system? And this is kind of a quick oversight, really. Thank you really to Fiona for actually giving a lot more detail of this. But if you look at the grain crops data, we've seen quite big increases in production. And underpinning this is actually increases in terms of crop yields, some phenomenal changes in terms of how we do breeding to actually get increased yields per hectare. But the other new player in the block is obviously vegetable oil production, the kinds of things that Fiona was talking about. So the soybean increase has been enormous, but that's been closely followed by palm oil. And what's happened there is actually a large expansion of cropped areas as well as increasing crop yields. Let's turn to the genetics and of livestock rather than just crops, because obviously livestock are linked to those crop systems. We've moved quickly in some places from kind of animals are either scavenging or grazing for their living, moving to kind of dual purpose systems, and then on into very specialized breeds. So if you look at that in the poultry sector, we have a situation where we have specialized layers that might produce an egg a day, which is phenomenal if you think about it. We've got broilers that can be finished in 35 or 40 days. And if you look at that in terms of how we've done those genetic breeding points, the difference between the size of a broiler, which is actually the white bird on the right-hand side, or the brown bird on the left-hand side, which is a layer, you can see actually there's quite big differences across that piece. These are all the same species, but very different breeds. You can apply this kind of logic into the cattle systems, into the pig systems. So we've started to actually move genetics and design animals in a very specific way in terms of meat, egg, milk, and fiber production. And we've been keeping those animals in different ways. Go back 150, 200 years, most of our animals would have been outside grazing and scavenging. We wouldn't have spent a lot of money or time thinking about housing them. We then started to move to think more carefully about forage and conservation systems and improving housing systems. Until today, we're actually designing both forages, concentrated feeds to actually improve their production. We've got very sophisticated handling systems where we can manage large groups of animals and reduce labor costs. Now, what has that done overall? Well, if you look at the data, unfortunately, I can't find more recent data on this. If you look at the data between 1920 and 2000 in the US, we've actually had huge increases of output in terms of output per space of these animals, but also output per unit of animal itself. This is just for the poultry sector. So we've gone from meat production of about 2.5 kilos per space, going up to about 12.5 kilos over that time period. So that's a massive change in terms of the genetics, the feeding nutrition, and the health of those birds. Now, what I would say within this is kind of interesting patterns where we've gone from situations where lots of the food grains we produce went to humans. Animals were very tightly tied into the situation with power and manure, with some crop residues actually being fed back to the animals themselves. The animals were nested within an ecology, something that Barry's taught me. And the food system, or the agricultural system, was nested within a wider ecology. So it's part of the wider environment. Animals were also part of that. There was some use of oil crops in certain spaces, and animals were a source of meat, fat, and milk, but they were largely tied into our agricultural system, and they were part of our family and our sort of society in general. Now, the exception I would say to this is horses. Horses were slightly different. They were often fed grain and high quality forage. They performed a massive role in terms of the expansion of different cropping areas. In the US, there were 25 million horses in 1918, and they actually consumed 25% of all the grain that was produced in that particular situation. So they were a major source of power. So were cattle in many situations. Now, what happens when these animals don't become very useful? Well, going back to this pragmatic and efficient, they simply disappear. These data from Australia. So you can see this peak of horse population in about 1920 and a rapid decrease as we started to adopt the combustion engine. So once we stop using animals and stop needing them, they do actually disappear. So that might well be the case if we start to switch towards other things away from meats. And we'll have to see how that actually plays itself out. There is a problem, of course, where we've got cultural association with animals. So 15% of our cattle population is in India, a country that actually reveres cattle. So how do we manage that particular process? That will be a big issue in the future. But in terms of this sort of background, I would say we've had two important crop revolutions so far. We've had the Green Revolution in the 1960s, led by Borlaug, and we've had the oil crop revolution in the 1970s, 1980s. Alongside that, we've had the replacement of animals by combustion engines, and we've had large tracts of land open up through that process. We can actually do things to land that we've never been able to do before, and a much smaller dependency on animal manure as it's been replaced by chemical fertilizers. Now, as we've done that, we've created cheaper food and feed grains. And what that means is that its tie between animals and food grain production has weakened, and we've stopped having this ecological balance. Oil crops have been an incredibly important source of energy and nutrients into the human diet. There's been residues fed back into animals, but not for the purpose of making them tied into that system, but actually to produce milk, eggs, and meat. And the wider environment is less important. Now, how is that food processed? Well, we've got a situation where we've got crop and livestock products that are transported and processed over long distance. And we've got a situation where we've gone from live animal sales to whole birds, to breast meat, and on to processed food. Now, that's kind of an interesting transition in terms of nutrients. So at this end, we've got micronutrients. At this end, we've just got protein and fat. And that's actually quite an important point when we think about improving nutrition. The availability of meats has increased dramatically over that time period. We've gone from about 25 kilos of meat and fish per person to about 62 kilos. And as I've mentioned before, that's largely been achieved through quite major changes in terms of how we keep those animals. That's replicated in places like the US, where again, big changes of meat consumption over a short period of time. It's happening in China on a day-to-day basis. So when we talk about reducing meat consumption, that's not the case in all parts of the world. And we can see this pattern of change and adaptation in Ireland, where we've had a peak in about in the early 2000s of about 100 kilos per person per year, dropping to about 80 kilos in 2017. Now, just a very specific example of this, in Australia, where we've got slightly better data, we can see that they've gone from a grass-based meat system to a grain-based meat system in one generation. How have they done that? Well, the relative price of things like poultry have actually dropped compared to beef. It's become cheaper in the supermarkets. It has health implications, and people have actually moved towards chicken and things like pork over a very short period of time. Plus, those products overall have become less important in terms of the shopping basket. Meat itself has gone down in relative terms across other goods in society over that time period. Our agricultural system has been very efficient. Now, I want to spin through very quickly what that means in terms of health. In terms of global health, we've moved infectious disease burdens towards more non-communicable disease burdens. So there's been an increase in this blue category of diseases across the piece. These are diseases related to things like eating foods and drinking alcohol. These are things that are actually problematic with regards to lifestyle. How have we done that? Well, we've done that through increased spending, particularly on infectious disease control, but also management of other things. And we're seeing the same sort of pattern develop in Ireland, where we've actually reduced the overall burden of health issues, and we've changed the pattern of burden more towards lifestyle related issues. And again, big expenditure in that particular space. Now, I think this is a success story, but it does come with a few problems and challenges. We've seen emergence of new pathogens. Coronavirus or COVID-19 is one of the most recent, but we've had others in the past. We've had a rise in foodborne disease issues. We've had contributions of the food system to the climate issues, and also continuing nutritional problems. So what happens when we get something wrong? Well, we get disease outbreaks. And you can go back to the 1980s when we had mad cow disease, all the way through to COVID-19 in the more recent past. We also have nutritional challenges, which actually lead to problems with regards to multiple burdens of malnutrition, not just undernutrition, but overnutrition. And we have climate change issues, which actually create problems with regards both the water distribution and growing seasons, and the fact that our food system is actually influencing climate overall. I'm going to skip through this quite quickly because I'm running out of time. So just thinking about this more carefully in terms of the emergence of this food system. This food system itself is actually generating problems in terms of infectious diseases, environmental impacts, and foodborne disease transmission issues, which have an impact on human health. And we have the issue of malnutrition. Now, it's important when we think about this more carefully in the future that we need to think about how do we internalize the costs of these negatives across this piece. Three priorities which I think are really important here. We need to optimize efficiencies to deliver the right food in the right place at the right time. We need to minimize public health problems caused by the food system and minimize the environmental damage caused by that system. I would say really important is that livestock are tied into our food systems. They affect people, and we need to place that into a One Health system to actually get the best out of what we're doing. I'll just finish with a final message that the food system should be at the heart of our One Health approaches in order to direct resources at both the sparks and the underlying causes of the problems that we're actually facing. Thank you. Back to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really excellent presentation. I'm going to jump straight to questions just in the interest of time, and so we can get through as many questions as possible. Just the first question here, what's your opinion on the importance of educating the general public in the UK, and I suppose in Ireland as well, on how food systems work? So for example, in schools, Or how do we get the government to handle the increase that we need in terms of the awareness around traditional food systems or the future sustainable food production systems?
I think I would say it's ongoing, this process of education. I mean, certainly in the UK television's channels, we've seen a lot more interest in terms of actually understanding where our food comes from and how it last 4 or 5 years as people have started to understand a bit better about what's going on in that space. And it becomes an aspect of interest. Actually helping people understand that it is a system and that if you squeeze hard on one end, it might pop out another side is actually probably more important. So I would make analogies to this in terms of a tube of toothpaste. I think there's lots of debate at the moment about things like rewilding in the UK without realizing that most of our food's not produced in the UK, it's produced somewhere else. So well-meaning actions in the UK don't necessarily mean good actions across the environment in general. And we have to get people thinking more carefully about the global aspect rather than just the national aspect of these challenges we're facing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point too. Do you feel like in the last couple of years in particular, with the increased focus on climate change, even that's drawing more attention to food production systems from the general public's perspective, I suppose?
I'd say in my own field, the heat is on with livestock production. So, you know, people are really aware. They're kind of, in some places, they're kind of embarrassed. They're actually part of the research on livestock production. I'm not embarrassed. I think it's actually what we do. Livestock are part of what many societies function. I think we have to actually have a bit more informed debate about what kind of proteins do we select. I am concerned that we are selecting processed proteins now, which may not have the nutritional benefits of things like real milk or real meat. And we may be manipulating our meat systems where we're actually isolating out micronutrients, which are really important in micronutrient deficient diets. So those types of issues, I think, are absolutely critical in terms of sort of moving us forward to a better space.
Yeah, I suppose that is the real critical point, is finding that balance between the nutritional quality and the sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues here, we've already gone through an experimental phase of having lots of processed food in our diets, which hasn't actually been very beneficial in terms of managing our weight. And if you look across what that is costing us economically, that's just enormous. We're adding another layer of processed food into our systems without really fully understanding what all the implications may well be to our health and our weight levels. That's something I think needs to be explored more carefully.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Really interesting. Another question that's come in is, how can we get our ecology balance back, and how long do you think that would take?
I think I'll let Barry answer that question a little bit later. I think he raised it. I think it's if you'd asked me that when I was born, when we only had 3 billion people on the planet, it might have been an easier ask. But now we've got 7, coming up 8 billion people, and can we actually do that? And I'm not quite sure whether that's the case. Plus, we have people with combustion engines everywhere that can dig up holes and plough land that we never even dreamt of doing before. So it is a real problem about how do we bring that ecology angle back into the agricultural space. Okay,
just a final question, just given the time here. Again, just mentioning really interesting presentation. How do we minimize or reverse the rural urban shift? So some of that data you presented around growing cities and reducing some cities getting smaller.
I think a very simple answer to that. We have to accept that food can't be as cheap as it's been. If we're willing to pay farmers a better return for what they do, then we don't have to have that much drift away from rural areas. By making food cheaper, we've actually made it impossible for people to stay on the land because they can't make a living out of that, or a living that's acceptable compared to what other people can make in the cities. I think it's a question mark of how do we create that balance between urban and rural spaces.
Yeah, really good point. That's brilliant. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thanks a million, Jonathan, and thanks to Fiona as well. So I'll just close this first session on the challenges we're facing. We're going to take a short break now before the next session, which is going to look at some of the solutions. And I'll leave it to Dr. Adele Kelly to take over and chair that session. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks very much to the previous speakers and to Afric. This session will have two speakers, Professor Tim Benton and Dr. Breach McAnulty, who will be addressing potential solutions when it comes to the rethinking of our food system. So each presenter will give a 20-minute talk, followed by a 5-minute Q&A. So there's just two things I need to remind the audience of, which is the Q&A function to the right. Please feel free to submit questions through that function. And the second reminder is to tag us on social media at UCD Ag Food or by using the hashtag UCD Food Systems. So I will start by introducing our first speaker, Professor Tim Benton of Chatham House in the UK, who's the Research Director in Emerging Risks. So Professor Tim Benton leads the Energy, Environment and Resource Programme at Chatham House. He joined Chatham House in 2016 as a Distinguished Visiting Fellow when he was also Dean of Strategic Research Initiatives at the University of Leeds. From 2011 to 2016, he was the champion of the UK's Global Food Security Programme, which was a multi-agency partnership of the UK's public bodies, which included government departments, devolved government and research councils, but all with an interest in the challenges around food. So he's worked with governments, the EU, G20, and has been a global agenda steward of the World Economic Forum and is an author of the IPCC's 2009 Special Report on Food, Land and Climate, and also the UK's Climate Change Risk Assessment. He's widely published in more than 150 academic papers, many tackling how systems respond to environmental change. His work on sustainability and leadership has been recognised with honorary fellowships of the UK's Society for the Environment and a Doctor Honoris Causa from the Université des Catholiques de Louvain in Belgium. So Tim, we're really delighted to have you join us today, and you have your presentation up, I see. And you can begin in your own time with your presentation, which is entitled Food Systems for People, Planet and Our Profit.
Thank you very much indeed. Lovely to be here. Pity I can't be with you in person. So I'm going to talk a little bit at least in the first half of the talk, in a complementary way to both the previous talks, particularly with respect to Jonathan's. Now, obviously, we know that our food system has impacts on the environment through multiple ways, whether it is through greenhouse gas emissions or various other, sorry, I'm battling with my buttons here, various other metrics of environmental impact, and whether you're growing livestock products or fruit and vegetables or legumes or anything else really. Any form of agriculture impacts on the environment. And what we're starting to see is that this environmental impact is becoming really determining of the future of our food systems, because they're driving things out of control. And if you look ahead, the role of greenhouse gases from food systems in anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions means that the chance of actually dealing with climate change and living within a Paris compliant world is slipping away from us very, very fast. Even if we decarbonized our systems today, if we did not change our food systems and the amount of greenhouse gases, we would still pass the kind of Paris carbon budget and live in a world of greater than 2 degrees. And we know, as Jonathan said, we know at the same time that our food system is driving suboptimal diets almost all around the world. And whether you look in sub-Saharan Africa or whether you look in across most of the developed world, a combination of undernutrition, micronutrient deficiency, and excessive calorie intake is the #1 cause of both morbidity and mortality on a global basis. So at one level, our food system is upsetting both our planet and, of course, people's health. And as Jonathan also alluded to, it is much more difficult in a world where cheaper food is the predominant paradigm. It is much more difficult for farmers to actually have a living. And one of the issues, particularly from a nutritional perspective, and Fiona alluded to this in the Irish context, but also in a global context, is that we are growing the wrong sorts of things that we need to grow to have healthy diets. So on this left-hand diagram is what we should be eating, according to a healthy eating guide, the Harvard one in North America. And on the right is, according to FAO data, what the world grows. And what you can see is we grow 1.5 times too much cereals and starch, and about 1/3 as much of fruit and vegetables as we need, far too much oil, to go back to Jonathan's oil revolution. And we don't really need to grow sugar at all, but we actually grow a whopping amount of it. So we've got a dysfunctional agriculture, which is not driving nutrition in the right way and is driving planetary unsustainability. And again, as Jonathan alluded to, but I'll tackle in a different way, this is all deliberative in a sense that we have designed the system based on the notion, certainly in the post-Second World War, Bretton Woods institutions, around the notions that people needed to be fed. If we increase productivity, we drive down the price of food, people can eat more, and as people eat more and save money on their daily shopping basket, they have more money to spend on growing the economy in other ways. And that's effectively the logical underpinning of our food system. And this is data plotted on the horizontal axis is cereal yield, and on the vertical axis on the left-hand panel is food price, and on the right-hand panel is calorie availability per capita. So what we've done is we've driven productivity, that's increased the per capita availability and driven down the price. And effectively, that was a very good outcome from the way that we used to think about the food system. But of course, now we can see all sorts of negatives arising from making food ever cheaper, as Jonathan said. On the left-hand panel at the bottom one is greenhouse gas. This is waste in terms of greenhouse gas emissions converted to CO2 equivalent. And again, on the horizontal axis is yield. Right-hand panel is prevalence of obesity. And what you can see is, unlike the top panels, where cereal yield linearly drives down food prices, on the bottom panels, cereal yield, as it increases, is driving up in an accelerating rate waste and obesity. And of course, that is because as we drive down food prices, it becomes economically rational on a global basis to throw food away. And as we surround ourselves with food, it becomes rational to eat it. And we've gone from a few meals to snacking. I think it is Mondelez, the snack company, reckons that there are 17 snacking moments during the day and designed products to meet all of those. So as we've been driving cheaper food, we're driving negative outcomes. And just to put this in a diagram a bit like Jonathan's, how does this cheaper food paradigm, as I call it, which is a combination of agricultural intensification through research, through scaling, etc., and coupled with globalization of trade, so that if you're good at producing something, you can sell it overseas and make more profit than if you're just domestically bound. How does that influence the sorts of things that we care about? So this is a long and involved diagram. Cheaper food, more of it, grown at scale, land conversion, etc. It's all driving climate change. Climate change is increasingly driving yield decline and will increasingly drive yield decline, which encourages more agricultural intensification. Yield decline drives agricultural expansion because we need new lands, because the yields are going down in various parts of the world. That impacts biodiversity. Climate change drives more competition for land because we're increasingly saying, well, we need to plant trees for land-based carbon dioxide removal. That also butts onto agriculture, and in some places is leading to agricultural expansion, which further drives climate change. As we intensify agriculture, it leads to soil depletion. Soil depletion drives down yields. Yields drives the need for agricultural intensification. As we drive agricultural intensification, that leads to the concentration on fewer and fewer crops. Half the world's calories come from 3 crops. 75% of the world's calories now come from 8 crops. As we concentrate crops in fewer and fewer species at larger and larger scales, that leads to monocultural agriculture, which drives down biodiversity. As we drive agricultural intensification, it drives down prices, which leads to more waste. More waste in turn leads to climate change. As we concentrate our efforts at growing more and more crops at fewer and fewer of them at larger and larger scales, it makes, as Jonathan was saying, it economically rational to feed grain to livestock. The more livestock we produce in many parts of the world is leading to eating the wrong things, particularly more processed meats, etc., which is driving malnutrition. As we concentrate crops all around the world, everybody's increasingly eating the same sorts of things, the starchy grains, the oils, the sugars, etc. And that in turn is driving the global NCD epidemic. You can see where this is going. As we have more livestock, it drives more climate change. And as we have more climate change, it reduces the nutrient content of food, contributing to malnourishment in all its forms. So what I want to emphasize from this is that we've got a fundamental problem with our food system, which is not because of farming. It's because of the way that we have constructed the whole food system. And we can't change farming to produce diverse, healthy diets without changing the incentives to do that, which involves changing a lot of these things and getting the system right. We are locked into a system which is increasingly dysfunctional. So increasingly, we are recognizing the externalized costs of our food system on health, on environment, etc., and increasingly on farmer livelihoods is driving our system in the wrong way. And our business as usual down the left-hand panel, we focus on productivity, we focus on efficiency, we talk about sustainable intensification, and each time we turn that ratchet, it makes things worse. It makes diets worse, it makes the landscapes worse, it makes climate change worse, and each one of these in terms feeds back into a very specialized, very large scale, very externalized costs system. But what could we do instead? How could we think about the future? Well, from my perspective, one of the key things to do is to say, instead of thinking about production efficiency, which makes food cheaper and leads to all of these Jevons paradoxes, we should focus on system efficiency. And what would an efficient food system be? It would one that feeds people whilst minimizing our normal agricultural inputs, capital, labor, synthetic inputs, but it also minimizes the healthcare costs that go from people eating the wrong things. And it also minimizes the environmental costs to the loss of biodiversity or climate change or whatever. So a measure of food system efficiency would not be how many calories can we produce as cheaply as possible. It would be how many people can we feed per unit of land or per unit of input. To get to a system like that, as Jonathan mentioned, we need to have a greater recognition of the values associated with food and not just see food as something that is a commodity to produce at the cheapest price. That would lead to higher farm gate prices. If we were going to have a food system that produced diets that were good for life, we would have a food system that would be more diversified. We would have to have much more integration of grain, horticulture, livestock, and much more of the kind of old mixed farms ideas, but in a modern way, more circular agriculture. If we had more diversified farming systems, we would have more multifunctional landscapes, fewer monocultures. It would probably lead to more rural employment, which would also stem the flow of the rural-urban transition. If we had an efficient food system with low waste in it, etc., it would free up the pressures on the land. It would make more space for carbon dioxide removal, planting trees, etc. So we'd also deal with climate change, and we'd also have landscapes that were more resilient. So there is a future that is possible to imagine. And as I go around the world talking about these sorts of things, most people kind of nod and say, yes, but I can't see the way to get there. Not, no, we don't want to do it in a different way. Of course, the major issue is the entrenched power relationships that the people who are locking themselves into the system through investment or the money or the power that they get from it do not want to change. But there are many systemic drivers of change. We are seeing on a global basis that effectively you can imagine business as usual not being an option anymore because of we're moving away from international rules-based cooperation. The multilateral world I grew up in is changing very rapidly. We're entering a period where there are trade wars, where we're expecting to see new conflicts emerging and so on. We see globally inequality as a huge driver of social change. We are seeing climate change disruption and environmental degradation reconfiguring the way things are done in a quite radical way, and COVID as an example of that. We're recognizing that our interconnected, just-in-time, really efficient food systems are also very fragile. And when they break, that leads to significant geopolitical change and drivers for change. And we have to start thinking about doing things in different ways. And we also need to move, because of the healthcare economics, as Jonathan said, we need to move to a system which is based around preventative healthcare. So we're having healthy lifestyles rather than waiting for everybody to get obese, high blood pressure, diabetes, and then realize we don't have a tax revenue to be able to support them and all of those issues around that. So there is a lot that is changing, that is driving us. And of course, as the world changes, things happen which further drive us in a different way. And whilst it's difficult to imagine, whilst it's difficult to imagine a business as usual system changing when the world is stable, when you throw in a heady mix of the occasional pandemic or the climate change disruptions or geopolitical reconfiguration or significant disruption in financial markets, huge changes in social attitudes, changes in the way that people interact with food, etc., you're into a situation where the chains that are locking us into this dysfunctional system are starting to loosen. And it was really interesting at the start of COVID when a number of world leaders stood up and said, effectively, COVID is an exemplar of the shocks to the system that will keep on coming to us unless we deal with them. And eventually our system will break and we'll have no option but to build it back better. Now, COVID doesn't seem to be quite strong enough to do that, but something will happen that will drive us in the right direction. One of the things, the final message I really want to kind of leave us with is that in a world where these shocks are also getting more frequent, we have to shift our design criteria, both away from the cheaper food paradigm, but also into thinking about resilience rather than thinking about efficiency. Efficiency by its nature drives out the costs, drives down the prices, and the driving down the prices leads to these Jevons paradox vicious circles, that if food is cheaper, because we're doing it more efficiently, people get hurt in multiple ways. So what, in a world of increasing disruption, geopolitical change, climate disruption, market change, etc., What do we need to think about if it's not efficiency? And the answer, of course, is redundancy. And redundancy has a number of properties. Some of them are listed on here, but diversification is one of them. Redundancy in functional redundancy is also one of them. That particularly applies to not just-in-time food supply chains, but it also applies on farm and so on. Systems that are modularized or distributed rather than centralized at scale, and flexibility. Now, the issue of all of these, of course, is that they cost. If we want to have a resilient system, that is antithetical to having an efficient system, because resilience costs. So as we move ahead, I'll skip this, that's too long to explain. As we move ahead, we want to get to the point where our food systems we're building them based around the criteria of value and resilience. And I will just skip over this. If you look about the alternative ways that the world might evolve, there are many plausible futures for how agriculture and farming might fit in. This is the results of a scenarios exercise that was done a couple of years ago with the World Economic Forum, where they looked ahead and said, well, the two principal areas of uncertainty about our future food systems are the degree to which we'll access global markets and we'll have global trade, or whether we'll deglobalize and move towards local or regional markets. And the degree, the horizontal axis, the degree to which we will shift diets from unsustainable and unhealthy towards sustainable and healthy diets. And there are many ways that events and regulations and market changes can drive all of those. And you end up with 4 sets of scenarios according to which quadrant you sit in. But what I just want to focus on for the last 30 seconds is, if you imagine a world where free trade continues, more globalization, etc., and we switch to healthier and more sustainable diets, you're in a world which is more or less business as usual, but with a few tweaks around sustainability and healthiness. So a world of commodity crops, long supply chains, ultra-processed food, lots of robotics, biotechnology, biofortification, and so on. But imagine a world in 20 years' time, European Union's fallen apart following Brexit. We've got another Trump. China is creating issues on a global stage. We've got lots of climate disruption, etc. Global trade might not be such a good idea then, and we might want to focus on local or regional markets. If we were growing food for local or regional markets, more varied diets to provide more nutrients, we'd have to design smaller farming systems which are more circular. Our agricultural efficiency will be less, so we have to really focus on low waste. We'd have agricultural policy designed for nutrition. We'd have shorter supply chains. We'd have less added value, so we'd buy raw food and cook it at home. So I'll skip that. The world is changing, and farming's role in it is changing, and that change is going to be driven endogenously and exogenously. We have to get out of this dysfunctional food system, and if we don't, then things will happen to change it. These change moments will happen more frequently. Building resilience from a farm scale perspective and an agricultural perspective is a key strategy for being able to cope from these. And agricultural technology is, of course, key to this system, but the agricultural technology that might apply in one circumstance is going to be very different from another circumstance. So don't bet that the future of agriculture is about large-scale monocultural agriculture. It might be about small-scale, circular, and regenerative agriculture. Thank you very much. Sorry, that was a bit whistle-stop.
Okay, Tim, thanks. Well, I think the Irish farmers would like what you've had to say there about potentially moving back to the smaller scale of agriculture rather than the larger scale where we certainly can't compete. So we have a number of questions for you. I'll just address the first one here. So the first one just wants to thank you for your presentation, but also to ask you, do you think the UK government does not emphasize the importance of reducing food waste and promoting sustainable diets? And the second part of that question then is, what recommendations would you propose to generally increase the public's consumption of sustainable diets and more a health conscious diet, and therefore addressing our challenges around overnutrition and obesity?
So to the first question, does the government recognise it enough? The answer is no, but it's starting to. With in England, the National Food Strategy of Henry Dimbleby is really, I think, going to focus on that sort of thing. And today's climate change committees recognition that to meet zero net carbon, we have to change diets as well as change farming, as well as change landscapes, etc. There are and from a health perspective, the issues of the obesity bill in the UK is at least 3 times the size of the value of our farming economy. So you're getting talk about preventative healthcare in Department of Health and so on. So these conversations 10 years ago weren't happening, now they are. And I think COVID has really thrown the light on how poor our food system is, particularly for the marginalized, that if you're on a diet, even though this is cheap food, the only food that you have is just absolutely shocking from a life perspective. So I do think the mood music is changing. The second question, I think my hope lies in, if we move towards a preventative healthcare system in terms of really encouraging people to eat the right things, then effectively we should be eating more fruit and vegetables and more plant-based protein. That will automatically drive down the amount of meat that you fit into your diet. And then you have the kind of golden overlap between what is a sustainable diet and what is a healthy diet, being 70 or 80% the same thing. So I think the likelihood of driving a sustainable diet is going to come through driving a healthy diet rather than the other way around. Although the whole meat discussion is an interesting one because it does resonate, as it's a relatively easy message. It does resonate, particularly with people with who are young and perhaps more willing to change diets relative to people of my age who are quite conservative by definition.
Okay, and just going back to your kind of overarching model there, the cheaper food paradigm, we have a question here that asks, is the cheaper food paradigm irreversible? And while the case is very compelling, where do we look for leadership within that very, very complex scenario that you put there?
So the cheaper food paradigm is really, I think, key to say, well, you can't tackle any one part of those interlocking vicious circles without tackling other parts of the vicious circles. And for me, it's not about saying we've got to work on soils, or we've got to reduce waste, or we've got to do biodiversity, or we've got to do climate change. It's about getting the incentives right. So if we, as consumers, are willing to pay more and waste less, even if we keep the same budget, if we're wasting less and paying more, we're going to be buying and eating different things. That will mean it will be profitable to grow different things. If it's profitable to grow different things and we want it to be sustainable as well, then that drives farmers growing less but better. And if they're growing less, then that gives space through their farm economies for more sustainable farming. You know, outside my window is the Yorkshire Dales. I'm very lucky to live up here. And some of my progressive upland farmer colleagues are reducing their outputs by 50, 60% and making more profit because they're growing things long growing, more sustainable land use management, and then selling it into kind of premium markets.
And Fiona touched on this earlier, like about the market. Is the market established? And I mean, there is risks there for changing your production systems.
Yeah, so I think, and Jonathan's just chatted me. There is a huge role for the private sector, but the private sector is effectively working between consumers who license by buying the products and regulators who regulate by making the policy. And so if we were, say, to put a carbon tax on food, if consumers were willing to accept that, then of course that would drive the market in a hugely different way. And then it would be up to the market to make the most profit from delivering low carbon foods, or however it would work out. So I think the market players are absolutely integral in this, but they will not drive things alone. They will be only driving in combination with citizen attitudes and regulatory frameworks.
Okay, and another UK specific question here as well for you. What is your opinion on food insecurity in the UK in regards to the cheaper food paradigm?
So food insecurity is shocking, with 5 to 8 million people or so who can't afford things. But that is a question of poverty. That is not a question, that is not a rationale for subsidizing the whole food system with the environmental damage that that causes. And that's really for two reasons. One is that just giving somebody access to the cheapest food gives them the worst possible diet and they suffer for it. It's not a good solution. And also by subsidizing the food system in the name of reducing poverty, it leads to stronger and stronger and stronger intergenerational effects. So what we ought to do is get the food system right and then support the poorest, not say we have to design the food system to deliver a bad outcome for the poorest in the name of the poor, which is rather too paternalistic, I think.
Yeah. You know, Tim, I think we're kind of just running out of time. We still have more questions coming in there, which also kind of address some of the issues you've touched on. But thanks very much for a really interesting presentation. And hopefully at some stage we'll have you in person in UCD to talk to us. Thanks very much, Tim.
Take care.
Okay, so we will move on to our second speaker. Again, I'll just remind the audience about the Q&A function and also to tag us on our social media at UCD Ag Food or by using the hashtag UCD Food Systems. So our second speaker is Dr. Breach McNulty from the School of Agriculture and Food Science here in UCD. And Breach is an assistant professor in human nutrition. So Breach, you're very welcome. I'm just going to give you the bio. So over the past 12 years, Dr. McNulty has managed the National Food Consumption Surveys in Ireland, and that really collects detailed dietary and lifestyle data from the Irish population. Bridget's main interests in terms of her research are using this food consumption data to gain a further and deeper understanding of the impacts of nutrients, food ingredients, and chemicals, the impact they have on health, with a view to underpinning food safety and policy. So Breach has widely published in this area with over 70 papers, and Breach, we're really looking forward to your presentation this morning, or this afternoon rather, which is entitled Modelling of an Irish Sustainable Diet. So Breach, the floor is yours if you want to take over there in your own time.
Yeah. And also I'd just like to thank the panel of the Symposium for inviting me here today to talk on the subject of modelling of an Irish sustainable diet. For the next 20 minutes or so, what I really want to do is take you through, I suppose, how we can use our existing data on food consumption and how we can potentially use that to model our way to a sustainable diet, to kind of provide evidence towards, I suppose, the solution of getting a sustainable diet here in Ireland. So to begin with, I suppose, and you've heard it here earlier this afternoon, when we look at global current dietary patterns, they're very much linked to increasing chronic diseases that we see in relation to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer. And also, they were not sustainable. We just can't keep consuming the food that we're consuming. And I think this was highlighted nicely in the Lancet Eat report that was published back in 2019, when they came up with this planetary health plate. And I'm not going to go too much into that because I think that will be covered later on this afternoon by Professor Willard. But I suppose I just want to echo the thought of that here, if we take it back to where we are in Ireland, it's very much the same when we look at chronic diseases. And I think that was highlighted nicely earlier in the presentations today. But also if we look here, the prevalence of overweight and obesity in Ireland, in all our different population groups, we do have rates of overweight and obesity. And although our research would suggest that we do see plateauing of the amounts of overweight and obesity in Ireland, they're still quite high. And therefore we need to look at this, and also we need to look at the sustainability of our diets. So before we kind of get started, I just wanted to take you back to this definition by the FAO of what a sustainable diet is. And I'm sure many of you have seen this before. And really it highlights that a sustainable diet are those diets with low environmental impacts. And I suppose that stands to reason. If you want it to be sustainable, you have to reduce that environmental impact from it. But also in this definition, it pulls out that it needs to be culturally acceptable, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be economically fair and affordable, and nutritionally adequate. So that's quite a lot. So if we want to get to that place where diets are sustainable, we need to take all of these into consideration. So it's like a pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. We have to put them together and look at them in our overall consumption of food. And to do that, we're really lucky here in Ireland. We need to firstly kind of look at the baseline of our food consumption patterns or our dietary patterns. And thankfully, over the last number of years, our Department of Ag, Food and Marine has graciously funded our studies to look at food consumption surveys. And you can see here, we have vast amounts of data ranging from our very young preschool children in Ireland right up into our adults and older adults. And what's nice about this data, it's data rich, and we have loads of information about what's consumed, when it's consumed, how we consume it, what brands we consume. But also it's relatively updated all the time in the sense that we have a current adolescence survey currently ongoing, and we'll release the results of that next year. But also we're going to go back and look at our adult data next year as well and gather more information. So we need to look at, okay, where we're at before we move forward. And I suppose no surprise, if we look at dietary patterns across our population groups, so if we look at children, adolescents and children's data, what we can see is that we have staple foods, and those staple foods are potatoes, breads, meats and dairy products. So they're providing the most amount of energy, or the highest amount of energy when we look at the food groups. Now, it's not to say that we don't have a wide variety of foods that we consume within Ireland, but they are still the staple foods. And in providing that energy, they also provide a huge array of nutrients that we need in our diets. And if I take you through the macronutrients, so if we look at the actual percentage energy coming from our protein or carbohydrates or fats across the population groups in Ireland, and you can see this is from the figure here. So we've got 3 groups here, and we're looking at carbohydrates, protein and fat. So if we take carbohydrates, we're in and around getting between 45 to 50% of our energies are coming from carbohydrate sources. And that would be within the recommended amounts that if we look at the European Food Safety Authority's recommendations. The same when we look at fat, 35 or in and around 35% of our energy comes from fat sources. And this would be in line with our recommendations. So more or less we're adequate when it comes to looking at carbohydrates and proteins and fats. However, there's still room for improvement. And we can see that if we look at saturated fats across the groups, it would be recommended by EFSA to be as low as possible, or in UK guidelines to be at least below 10% of our energy coming from saturated fat. And you can see indicated here in the red bar that we're above this. So we're in and around 13 to 14% across the different population groups in Ireland. So we have room to improve when it comes to our macronutrients, in particular, obviously, saturated fat here. And if we look at our food groups, and I think this was echoed earlier, we really need to improve in certain food groups. And I've just taken 2 examples here, and one that we all know probably is fruit and veg. If we look at fruit and veg, we can see that the amounts that we're consuming is lowest in adults, just over 190 grams per day, and highest in our children. However, if we think about the recommendation being 5 to 7 portion sizes a day or 400 grams a day, we're nowhere near this. If we also look at whole grains, so whole grains have been shown to be beneficial to health, and it is recommended in our current dietary guidelines that we increase or choose whole grain products. And if we look at adults here, we're consuming about, on average, 28 grams per day. And if we take the American guidelines of 48 grams per day, we're nowhere near this. So there is room for improvement. Again, if we take in the Irish population, and I've taken a particular group here just to focus in on this, in women of 18 to 64-year-old women or over 65-year-old women, and look at nutritional adequacy. And this is looking at different selected nutrients and looking at amount of the population, if these particular groups that aren't meeting the recommendation or the estimated average requirement for each micronutrient. And you can see, no surprise, vitamin D, where we don't get enough of it in our diet, but also of some concern would be iron. Also, there's a certain amount of inadequacy in calcium and folate, and you can see all of them, and iodine. So what my point is that even though we have our current dietary patterns and current food consumptions, we are still not adequate in all nutrition. And we do have to understand, I suppose, that animal products have an important contribution to nutrient adequacy. So we can't forget this as well. So if we take dairy, for example, it's a huge contributor, as I stated earlier, to energy, but it also contributes protein, calcium, vitamin D, and folate. And importantly, iodine in Irish society, with nearly 47% coming from dairy sources. So when we have to work towards a sustainable diet, we need to consider this. We need to consider the nutritional adequacy of the diet and the sources within our diet that are providing the nutrients. So how do we go about doing this? How do we go about shifting towards a sustainable diet and using the data that we have currently to move towards that? And I suppose it's a modeling approach that I would be suggesting. So we have this data-rich data on food consumption. We have it on all our population groups. So now we need to use that and look at that and incorporate all those factors that make up a sustainable diet and look at them individually and combine them together into a modeling approach. So how do we do this? Well, firstly, we need to assess nutritional adequacy. So we need to make sure in all our population groups in Ireland that we have adequacy nutritionally, and we can do this in a number of ways by looking at the current data. So there is applications of food-based scoring system or nutrient-based scoring system to look at nutrition quality. The food-based systems, as you can see down here, are some of them are examples are the Mediterranean diet indexes that can be used, or the healthy eating indexes. And basically what it's doing is looking at the foods that are associated with this type of diet and see how we comply to that. The other scores that we can use are nutrient-based scoring systems, where we, instead of focus on particular foods, we focus on the nutrients that we need. And look at the amounts of these nutrients and the probability of being adequate in these nutrients. And we can limit nutrients as well in relation to fat and sodium. And then there's new research emerging that you could potentially use a hybrid model. So both a food-based and a nutrient-based model combined. So there's lots of ways in which we can do this. And just to give you an example of work that was completed on this by Adam Dranowski, in his paper looking towards healthy diets from a sustainable food system, you can see here he has applied the NRF 9.3 nutrient score, and he's looked at it in relation to American food categories in the USDA. And what you can see here is that as we increase the nutrient quality of a food, in particular fruit and veg here, the energy density is reduced. So he's comparing this to energy density. And this shows the application, I suppose, of how we can use these nutrient scores or food-based scores. And currently ongoing, we're working in this area. In particular, my PhD student, Laura Kerwin, is working in applying this score, and we're going to focus in on the PAN diet score to apply it to adults that we're doing at the minute, and then to our adolescents and children to look at overall adequacy of the diets. And then we need to consider the environmental impact. So we need to reduce that environmental impact of foods. So we need to apply these factors that account for or have an impact on the environment. And they've come up before in other presentations today. And I'm a bit out of my field in this because I am a nutritionist and this is not my area, but something that I'm beginning to understand more so about. So when we look at the environmental impact, we need to consider greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of studies that have looked at food consumption or dietary patterns have looked at it in this way, have applied the greenhouse gas emissions as a factor to account for the environmental impact. But the more that we go into it, we need to consider that there are other factors as well, such as water uses, land usage, biodiversity, nitrogen, fossil energy, phosphorus, food waste and packaging. All of these factors need to come together, and we need data on this, and that's what we intend to do. And also we need to consider the food that we produce here, the food that we consume here, and that impact. And with the data that we have, we can understand from the databases where that food is coming from. So we should be able to apply that in a scoring system. And the last two is the economical impact. So a diet that is sustainable and that it is nutritional adequate does have to be affordable to our different population groups, including those towards the lower social classes or incomes. And a method in which we can do this is look at the proportion of income spent on diet. So we can apply this in a scoring system or food prices. So there's two ways in which we incorporate this in. And the next is social consideration. So if we've got a cost-effective, sustainable, adequate, nutritionally diet, there's no point in having it if we can't change the social, or we can't change the population to move towards it. And I suppose one use in this modeling exercise is that we're using the current eating patterns. So we're delving into what we currently do and trying to tweak and shift that to see how we can come up with a more sustainable diet. And the modeling approach would really take into consideration all of these things and create a kind of a sustainable dietary intake. So this is one approach that has been published to look at a sustainable dietary index, where we can assess the overall sustainability of diets using all of these 4 categories. And if we have this baseline information on how sustainable our Irish diets are currently, then we can use that in using or shifting towards a sustainable diet by tweaking or making changes that potentially people or some of the researchers earlier today have mentioned, such as Fiona, if we tweak the nutritional value of crops. And just to give you an example of a cohort that have used this is a paper from the French population, where they looked at Nutrient Net Santé study cohort, and they devised a sustainable dietary index. There's a lot of data in this, and I don't want to go through all of this data, but this is looking at the relative differences in food intake between quintiles. So in relation to the sustainable dietary index. And you can see quite clearly, and what that was evident from that paper is that those diets that were higher and more adherent to a sustainable diet would be higher in that fruit and veg, higher in those cereals, legumes, nuts and oilseeds, and lower in that processed meat. Okay. So in conclusion, where do we go with this? So in order to shift our Irish diet to a more healthier and sustainable food consumption, what we need is this baseline data. So this baseline data that we're currently combining with all those factors incorporated in. And then we know where we're at. Then we can see what changes can be made. So what changes can we make to that food system? And if we can then incorporate them changes into the current or into our baseline diet, do we move towards a sustainable diet? So that will be where we hope to go, and then have these model diets, and that will hopefully help to guide the future public health policies in relating or in creating a more sustainable diet. So lastly, I just want to thank and acknowledge the Irish University's Nutrition Alliance team that are behind collecting all of this food consumption data. So there's a huge team across many different institutes that work together to collect all this data in relation to food consumption. And also our funders, Department of Ag, Food and Marine, for actually funding these consumption surveys in Ireland. And I'd like to thank you all for listening and take any questions.
Okay, Breach, thanks very much for that very interesting and very detailed presentation. It seems you've got a very rich database there to work with, which is fantastic. One of our first questions here from the audience is around education. So how important is education in informing the public on what is actually a sustainable diet?
I think it's really important, and I think it's a question that consumers are asking, because there's a lot that, if we look at that definition by FAO, there's a lot that we have to consider in a sustainable diet. So it's not just about reducing that environmental impact of foods. We also need to look at that nutritional quality. We need to look at, is it cost effective? Can everyone access this diet? So education is always key. It's an always important part of educating the consumer in what it is to understand a sustainable diet. Yeah.
I suppose at the moment, maybe we're not quite clear on what is a sustainable diet. Maybe we're kind of preempting that. But how well are we performing in terms of what we know about the Irish diet and how sustainable it is by comparison to maybe our European counterparts or other researchers? How well are we doing? How well do we understand Irish?
I suppose that's what we're trying to figure out, is at a baseline level where we're at. And we have improvements, but even if we just go to the current dietary guidelines that are in existence, where we can improve them, and we can improve the amount of fruit and vegetables we consume, we can improve the amount of whole grains we consume, we can probably reduce processed foods to reduce the salt component, the sugar components in our diet. And even if we just did that, and like I suppose Tim mentioned it before, if we can even adhere to those healthier dietary guidelines, that would even improve, I'd say, our sustainability. So we have improvements to make, but yes, hopefully we'll have a baseline level to go with in the data that we publish next year.
Yeah. I just have another question in here about, what level should we start? And it asks, should we start education at primary school?
Personally, I think yes. I think the earlier the better. I think we really need to educate people on where our food comes and what that means and how important it is to not only nutrition, environment, etc. So I think children are great. Their minds are opened to learning this. So why not at that point? So that means that they take an interest in not only their food, but in their environment and their diet and their health. So yeah, that would be good to start earlier.
Yeah. And what do you think about labeling? I've heard Tim talk about labeling before and trust in labels and that kind of thing. So the question from the audience is, do you think a sustainable labeling approach on food would work?
Good question. I personally, I don't know. I think even if the labeling that we have currently, if we look at that, I think there's confusing messages on the labeling, and I don't fully think that the consumer understands what all those different components of a label is even. So to add another component on sustainable, how does that reflect? And is it just the food itself, or should we not be looking at a whole complete picture of a dietary pattern, and we're on the food itself instead of just focusing on particular items? But so I suppose I'm on the fence, but I'm not sure that it would completely work.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. We have to deal with a lot when it comes to labeling as consumers. And what about your initial kind of findings from the pan diet study? How have you any kind of initial figures as in terms of how well we're performing of the overall scores of the adult diets yet?
No,
Okay.
it's currently in progress. No, my PhD student Laura is currently working away on the adult data. So we're just finalizing that, and then to compile it with the new children's data and the teens data that we'll have. So we hope to present that next year to where we're at, and to use that obviously to create a more, or to see where we are in a baseline sustainable diet. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. We'll be looking forward to hearing from you and from your PhD student with that. So, Breed, we're going to have to leave there. There's a few other questions, but thanks very much for your contribution to today's program. So just for the audience, just to let you know, we'll be taking a couple of minutes break now, and we'll be back here at 3:05. So hopefully you can join us then. And thanks very much to Tim and to Bridge. And we look forward to the next session, which is looking at the state of the art with Dr. Helen Sheridan. Okay, thanks, guys.
Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome back to the third session where we'll be examining state of the art. I'm Helen Sheridan. I'm a lecturer in agricultural ecology and policy at the School of Agriculture and Food Science, and I'll be chairing this session. Our first speaker today is Dr. Zoe McKay, and the title of her presentation is Sustainable Ruminant Systems. Dr. McKay is an assistant professor of dairy production and coordinator of the dairy business program in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in UCD. She completed a degree in animal science and a PhD in dairy cow nutrition in UCD. Following time spent in industry as a ruminant technical specialist, Dr. McKay then returned to UCD. In her current position, Dr. McKay is continuing her focus on the role of nutrition on improving dairy production, milk quality and sustainability. Dr. McKay has published internationally and is actively involved in the systems research herd at Lyons Farm, which is focusing on the development of a sustainable, profitable, high output grass-based spring milk production system. After Dr. McKay's presentation, we'll have 5 minutes for questions. So I'd ask you to use your question function for that. And for those of you who are using social media, please tag us on @UCD or hashtag UCD Food Systems. So I'd like to ask Dr. McKay to begin her presentation now, please.
Thank you very much, Helen, for the introduction. And I'd just like to take a moment to thank the organisers in UCD for the opportunity to speak to you today on sustainable ruminant systems and where that fits into when we're rethinking the food system. So as has been mentioned earlier this afternoon, from a global context, we have a growing world population, and that ultimately means we have an increased demand for high quality food. But within this demand, it's important that we recognise there will be an increased demand for animal-derived protein. And it is projected that by 2050, this demand will increase by 50%. However, with that in mind, agriculture has come under increasing focus recently from a sustainability and environmental perspective. An additional challenge is from a consumer perception of our agricultural practices. Consumers are much more aware of where their food is coming from, how it's being produced, and what impact that has on the environment. So with this opportunity of increasing food demand and supply, it's also going to be a huge challenge, and one of the most important challenges that is going to face humanity in the next century. But when we're talking about sustainable food production and how it relates directly to ruminant production, it's important to understand what exactly we mean by sustainability. And there's 3 elements to this. The first is our environment and our planet. How are the management practices and our agricultural practices impacting on the soil, water, and biodiversity of our planet? When we think of our society and our people, how are we supporting food quality and safety, upskilling of our farmers to carry out these practices, but also supporting rural living? And the third element is the economy. We're supporting our farmers' income while also ensuring we have an affordable food supply for the people of our countries. While sustainability is at the heart of agriculture, it also presents a challenge, and this has been reflected in a number of strategies that have been put forward in recent times. This is primarily coming from the EU Green Deal through our Farm to Fork strategy. We have an overall aim to be carbon neutral by 2050, but in the interim, we have to focus on our 2030 targets. We have to reduce the level of greenhouse gases that are being emitted by 10 to 15%. We also have to look at how we improve our water quality, and this will be done through the reduction in nutrient losses by 50% and the reduction in our use of artificial fertilizers by 20%. And this all needs to be done to achieve our carbon neutral target of 2050. And at the same time, we must focus on the biodiversity of our environment and increasing the biodiversity of our grasslands. So within this, where do our ruminants fit into a sustainable agricultural system? And ruminants are very important in terms of our food supply chain, because they are very unique and that they have the ability to convert fibrous feedstuffs, such as grass, into highly nutritional products such as meat and milk that otherwise us people would not actually be able to utilize. So these are very important outputs in terms of our milk and meat, but also in a global sense, there's a number of different countries and cultures out there that also rely on ruminants for power, fuel, fertilizer, and as a building material. So in a global sense, we can see how important ruminants are to our agricultural systems, and it's vitally important that we support that system from a sustainability perspective. I'm going to move the focus a little bit now from a global perspective more to a national perspective, and how through our ruminant systems here in Ireland, what factors are the main factors affecting how sustainable that system is. And the first one is our competitive advantage to grow grass, which we must utilise and capitalise on. The second is we need to reduce the impact of ruminant production on global warming. And third, we have to increase the nitrogen use efficiency of our ruminant systems to protect our water quality and the environment. So firstly, to touch on our grassland element. Grassland is very important in our sustainable systems. Over 90% of the diet of our ruminants comes from grass. So that shows the importance of it. It's also very important in terms of our competitive advantage because we have a temperate climate that allows us to produce a lot of grass. And with that, 92% of our agricultural land area grows grass. It's also important from a cost and benefit perspective because grass is actually the cheapest feedstuff that's available for our ruminants to consume. It also offers benefits in terms of the health and welfare aspects of our ruminants because they're outdoors grazing and allowed to express their natural behaviours. But it's also positive on the perspective of the consumer because they have this much more positive image of where their food is coming from. And subsequently, grassland plays a very important role within that sustainable ruminant system. But it also offers the opportunity for us to enhance and develop the biodiversity of that system. And when we look at our grass species, we focused on over 90% of our ruminant diet is coming from grass. And traditionally, we focused very much on producing a perennial ryegrass-based pasture. And this had multiple benefits in terms of its output in terms of yield. However, one of the negative aspects is the requirement for nitrogen by perennial ryegrass for it to grow. So there's been a huge research focus over the last number of years on incorporating white clover into our system. And the focus with white clover is because it allows the opportunity to capture nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix that into a form that our plants can use. And this adds other benefits in terms of reducing the amount of chemical nitrogen that we require. It also improves performance of our animals, so increased milk output and increased live weight gain in our lambs and cattle. But also it captures that nitrogen and makes it available. However, grassland research has gone one step further in terms of looking at the role of multi-species swards in grassland management. When we talk about multi-species swards, we're talking about different types of ryegrasses, incorporating legumes, but also looking at different herbs like plantain and chicory. And research to date, while it's in an early stage, has seen very positive impacts that this can have and a very crucial role it can have in sustainability. We are increasing biodiversity by increasing our plant populations. We're looking at improving the soil structure through their different roots of the plants, increasing animal performance, but ultimately we're also reducing our nitrogen inputs and increasing the nitrogen that's being actually utilised by the animal. So this is a very novel and exciting area, but it is early days, but we're seeing huge potential in the area of multi-species across a number of projects that are currently ongoing here in Ireland. The second important sustainability challenge that we're facing is that of enteric methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas that's naturally produced as a byproduct of rumen fermentation. So it's the breakdown of carbohydrates in the stomach or rumen of our animals that releases this methane emissions or greenhouse gas. And as our agricultural sector has grown, we've had a growing population of ruminants, and subsequently 35% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. And within this, we look at methane specifically, 56% is coming from methane. And the negative aspects of methane is in terms of its global warming potential, which is 28 times that of CO2. However, that's on a global warming potential of 100 metric system. But it's important to acknowledge that methane is part of a natural cycle. When methane is emitted from our cows through their breath, it goes into the atmosphere and it lasts for about 9 to 12 years. At that time, it's broken back down into water and carbon dioxide, which goes back into our grasslands. So it's part of the natural carbon cycle. When we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions and their from milk, we have a more positive story. Ireland is the most greenhouse gas efficient producers of dairy within the EU, as you can see on this diagram where Ireland is highlighted. However, we still have a long way to go to achieve our targets, but we are very much committed through research and through technology adoptions to move forward and further reduce the greenhouse gas emissions coming from our ruminant populations. So in terms of our methane emissions and our mitigation, so we look firstly at the technologies that are available to reduce methane. We can look at our green breed, which is looking at identifying methane emitting cattle and sheep that produce lower levels of methane. And this is building on work from New Zealand, where they've selected lower methane emitting sheep, which would reduce methane emissions by 10%. Also, if we look on nutritional aspect, if we increase the quality of our grasses, we can reduce our methane emissions between 18 to 20%. If we look at supplements like linseed oil, we can reduce it by 20%. There's also a very important role when we're talking about mitigating methane emissions on feed additives, such as Bovaer and Agolin, which have been found to reduce methane emissions by 24 and 10% respectively. So there's huge opportunity currently ongoing through research and future planned research and how we can mitigate and reduce the methane emissions from our ruminants. The third and last sustainability challenge is our nitrogen losses. And if we think of our nitrogen cycle, we're focusing on the inputs going into our animals or into our land. We're talking about how efficient that animal can utilize those nutrients, and then what is being excreted and how we manage that. So from a dietary perspective, we're looking at our diets are primarily made up of grass, but however, in times when grass is in short supply, or when our animals need a little bit of extra feed to support their performance, we offer concentrate supplementation. And it's through that element of the diet that offers the greatest opportunity to reduce the protein and nitrogen input into our animals. So through that part of the diet, we can reduce the amount of protein. It also creates an opportunity to look at feed additives based on the likes of tannins and essential oils that can actually capture more of the protein from our grass and make it more available. Again, showing the opportunities within multi-species swards. If we can incorporate some plants like plantain, we can increase the nitrogen use efficiency of the system. The other side of the nitrogen aspect is looking at the manure and fertilizer. So we need to reduce our nitrous oxide emissions, which is another greenhouse gas, but also 98% of our ammonia emissions are coming from agriculture, particularly coming from our manure and fertilizers. So new technologies looking at different ways of spreading our animal waste on the land, looking at different forms of fertilizer and how we can put out more of a protected form. Again, as I mentioned with clover, being able to capture more of that atmospheric nitrogen and putting that into our plants and soils and having the additional benefit then of incorporating biodiversity. So again, there's huge opportunity here through research and new technologies of how we're going to tackle nitrogen emissions. Finally, I want to just touch on some work that's been currently carried out in UCD on the UCD Lions Farm, where we're looking at a dairy systems herd. And the aim of this herd is to address some of the environmental and farm level concerns around dairy production. We have grown our sector hugely in the last number of years, and we've increased our animal numbers. However, that might not be possible going forward, particularly from an environmental perspective. But also there's some farms that don't have the land or the capacity to increase numbers, and we wanted to evaluate how they can grow and develop their business. So if we can increase the output per animal while still very much focusing on grass within our system to keeping grass to over 90% of the diet, if we're able to, on a systems level, bring all of these new technologies with us, so our low emission slurry spreading, our multi-species swards, bringing our different forms of protected fertilizers and reducing the protein content of our diets, if we can bring this all into a systems evaluation as opposed to individual components. And we've tried to do that recently through the systems herd at Lions. And we were able to measure this through life cycle analysis, which gives you an estimate on a systems level how the system is impacting on the environment. And what you can see from the diagram, on a national average, 1.13 is our life cycle analysis of kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of fat and protein corrected milk. And what we've achieved through this herd is that we've reduced that to 0.88, which is a great achievement, and shows that if we can incorporate the research and the new technologies that are coming on board, that we can head in the right direction. So we found that a high output grass-based system can be profitable when we build it on a foundation of good grassland management. We meet the targets that we set out for ourselves, and this will have a place in a sustainable Irish dairy industry. So finally, just to finish up, we do no doubt have challenges ahead of us, but I like to think of it on a more of a positive note, that there are opportunities within that. There's a very important role for research, as we've seen with some of the new technologies and research that is available, but knowledge transfer is going to be very important to get that research out at farm level. It's very important that we have collaboration across the whole industry. And if we can achieve those three things, definitely a sustainable ruminant system is achievable. I think it's important that we acknowledge we have an industry full of passionate, hardworking people that are dedicated to addressing these challenges within our ruminant systems and are striving for a green and healthier agriculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for that presentation. It was really interesting there. You mentioned it there about this idea of getting these, you have all of these measures for enhancing sustainability. There's research ongoing on them. What's uptake at farm level like in terms of those measures, Zoe?
Yeah, so in terms of, I suppose, uptake at farm level, that's probably kind of another challenge in itself, Helen, to be honest, getting these technologies out on farm. But I think farmers are very much aware of what's coming, and they're very conscious, I suppose, of their own impact on the environment. So like coming from next year, we're going to have increased focus around, especially from the nitrates, from a nitrogen perspective. A lot of these new technologies farmers will have to adopt. For the likes of our low emission slurry spreading after next April, farmers have to work with that. We're going to have a limit around the level of protein in the concentrate for our cows to consume when they're at grass, so it can't be over 16%. So we're definitely heading in the right direction, and it's as more research comes on stream, I think the role and importance around knowledge transfer is going to be even more important. Okay.
Just one of the first questions in from the audience here. Are the methane mitigation measures cumulative? So would utilising a selection of them allow farmers to reduce methane emissions by the sum of the individual methods or not? And if not, I suppose, why not?
So I think when we're talking about the methane emissions, it's quite complicated. I suppose the method we're using at the moment is the report is the GWP 100 metric system. And that's what we're, I suppose, how we have to report on, because that's what it's being counted as. And I think there's other methods there that we could be looking at, which would, I suppose, probably give a better understanding of how these shorter term pollutants are actually behaving in the atmosphere. But I think we're probably in kind of the early days of trying to fully understand how we're going to tackle methane. But definitely from the measurement perspective, it's an issue also. Yeah, but I think it's still a way to go to, suppose, evaluate that fully to answer that question, I think.
Okay. There's a second question here on methane. Are the reductions in methane discussed, are they permanent, or does the animal adapt to the introduced feed, for example, linseed, and return to the typical methane output? Do we have data on that yet, Zoe?
Yeah, so I suppose particularly with the additives and with the feed supplements, like those limitations to research, and we are looking at them more in short term, and there is a requirement there for more longer term studies to see how these play out. But in terms of the linseed oil, that was ran over a 50-day period. But when that was removed, we did see that the emissions increased. So we do these are strategies that need to be put in place and kept in place. And we do need more research, long-term research, to see exactly, I suppose, does the animal adapt to these strategies or not? But they're all different. Like, we do have a number of avenues to explore still.
Okay. Yeah, so the next one, what would dramatically improve implementation of multi-species swards, do you think, on Irish farms? What's missing there in terms of getting them in?
I think, I suppose, the research is still in early days, and I suppose farmers are so confident in how they grow perennial ryegrass and how that fits in their system and they can rely on it. So I think it's bringing the research to the front. It's getting that data and that kind of support out there for farmers to incorporate them. I think it's going to take a little bit of a mindset and a mindset change for all of us in how we're approaching our sustainable ruminant systems. But in terms of getting the multi-species on farm, there's definitely farmer interest. There is some farmers even going ahead with them now to see how they get on. But I think for the majority to come on board, it will really be research and knowledge transfer driven.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, I do agree that a bit of a mindset change is probably required there, all right. This is a comment, I suppose, but perhaps you would like to comment on it as well. It's vitally important that education and research speak as one voice. A risk with systems advice is the tendency to chase output rather than profit.
Yeah, so on that question. Yeah, well, I think that's important. The aim of the kind of slide at the end, just to focus on the system side, was to show, I suppose, that we can, when we bring all these together, what is potentially possible. But both research and education is critical in how, you know, having the individual trials and having the education system there to get this message out to our students in UCD, so that they're going out into the industry with that information, but also through knowledge transfer to get it back down to farm. But yeah, I think that it's a fair comment.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Zoe.
Howard, thank you very much.
Yes, so our second speaker today, and again, I just remind you to use your question function for questions as they arise during the presentation. Our second speaker is Professor Walter Willett of Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Professor Willett is a professor of epidemiology and nutrition. He has served as a chair of the Department of Nutrition at Harvard for 25 years. His work has focused on development of methods using both questionnaire and biochemical approaches to study the effects of diet on the occurrence of major diseases. He has applied these methods to large cohort studies, including nearly 300,000 men and women that are providing the most detailed information on the long-term health consequences of diets. Professor Willett has published over 2,000 articles, primarily on lifestyle risk factors for cardiometabolic disease and cancer, and has written the textbook, Nutritional Epidemiology. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine, and the title of his presentation here today is Healthy Personal and Planetary Diets. So, Professor Willett, in your own time.
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction. What you're doing today is exceedingly important, and I'm really honored to be part of your program. What I'm going to do is to give a overview of work that we did as part of the Eat Lancet Commission. This is a group of 35 people that are scientists from multiple disciplines, nutrition, agriculture, earth sciences, and many others that came together, funded by the Wellcome Trust, to look at the challenge of how could we feed what will be about 9.8 billion people in 2050, a diet that is both healthy and sustainable. This is a huge challenge if we look at it from the nutrition side. Today, we still have about 2 billion people who lack key micronutrients in their diet. We have over 150 million children still stunted. 2 billion adults are overweight or obese. And if we look around the world, diet quality is far from optimal in all countries. Perhaps the most visible part of the nutrition problem is the obesity epidemic. And this is happening in almost every country around the world, both rich and poor, in men and in women. On the climate side, this is something that I, of course, brought everyone, I think, in this conference together. And I don't have to convince anybody that this is serious, even though our president still thinks it's a hoax. There's lots of details and statistical models, but you actually just need to open your eyes and look at what's happening around the world and see that the Arctic Ocean is opening up like it never did before. The ice cap on Mount Kilimanjaro, which we lived in Tanzania in the 70s, it was hefty and thick. It's almost gone and will be gone in about a decade. Glaciers are retreating all around the world, and most ominously, the Greenland ice cap is now melting at a rate 7 times faster than it was just in 1990. What's really worrisome about these processes is that they're not linear. We knew a few decades ago that temperatures were increasing, but they're now accelerating at a rate that no one really predicted not very long ago. And the part of the problem is we're entering vicious circles as things heat up more. Methane is released from melting tundras, from the Greenland ice cap opening up, and from shrinking biomass in forest. And that further accelerates the temperature increases, and this vicious circle is going around and around. So what, again, the task you are undertaking is extraordinarily important and urgent in a way that we did not anticipate not so long ago. So given that background, this was a very complicated task our commission was given. And what we decided to do was break this down into 4 steps. First, defining a healthy reference diet. We could have started some other ways, but this is where we began. And that was based on the best available evidence from all types of studies, controlled feeding studies, long-term cohort studies, and where we had them, randomized trials. Then we defined planetary boundaries based on the work of our earth scientists. And third, we applied a global food systems modeling framework to analyze what combinations of measures are needed to stay within the planetary boundaries while still delivering healthy diets. And then we looked at some strategies to move this area forward. And I would mention this, again, this is looking at the global picture and what you are doing and bringing it down to countries and some places even subnational regions is really important because there's no single solution. That's clear. I'm going to use an example looking at various major protein sources to show the kind of thinking that we use going through this process to define a healthy diet. The first was just to simply look at the composition of different foods. Here we're looking at the ratio of polyunsaturated fat to saturated fat for major protein sources. And we know that more polyunsaturated fat and less saturated fat reduces blood cholesterol levels, a major risk factor for heart disease. And it's well known that beef has quite a bit of saturated fat, but it also has very little polyunsaturated fat, which the polyunsaturated reduces blood cholesterol levels. Chicken has quite a bit more polyunsaturated fat, so it's quite a bit better than beef from a composition standpoint. Salmon even better, but if we really want high PS ratios, we need to look at the major plant protein sources like nuts, tofu, and lentils. That composition alone would predict or suggest that shifting to more plant-based diet, those kind of healthy plant sources of protein would be beneficial for heart disease. But we then looked at the next level of evidence, which are controlled feeding studies that compared red meat, for example, with different types of protein sources. And as you can see, if we look at red meat compared to healthy, high quality plant proteins like legumes, soy, and nuts, then there was a significant, substantial increase in LDL cholesterol, bad cholesterol. And this is from a meta-analysis of about 22 studies. Some colleagues in Potsdam, Germany have taken this another step to look at the effects of different protein sources, different foods on multiple risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Like these are LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, total cholesterol, good cholesterol, fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and insulin resistance, blood pressure, inflammation. And they used 66 randomized studies that they could find. This is called a network meta-analysis to be able to rank the healthfulness of these different foods based on short-term feeding studies looking at risk factors for heart disease. And as you can see at the top, we have nuts, legumes, whole grains, plant sources, then fish, fruits and vegetables, refined grain, and then we come into the animal source foods, red meat, eggs, dairy, and worst of all, of course, sugar sweetened beverages, which have no nutritional value, only harm metabolically. Again, this would suggest that shifting from these animal sources of protein to more plant-based protein sources with fruits and vegetables and whole grains would be healthier. But this is looking, again, short-term studies of a few weeks looking at what this does to our body metabolism. So in addition, we used evidence from large-term cohort studies, and that's the kind of study we've mostly been conducting ourselves. This is the Nurses' Health Study, over 121,000 women, started back in 1980 when we first collected diets, or tracking diets over time, looking at what people eat and then what happens to them in disease risk. We added men and another 100,000 women as we have looked over the years. When we now have 3 or 4 decades of follow-up from these cohort studies, we've looked again at analyses comparing different sources of foods with many endpoints. This is looking at all-cause mortality. And here we have several 100,000 people, over 30,000 died, so lots of statistical power. And we can look at what would be considered, again, a ranking of different foods in relation to total mortality. Worst is processed meat. This is, I should mention, per 3% of energy from protein, giving equivalent amounts of protein in this analysis. Then eggs, unprocessed red meat. Here the comparison is dairy, sort of in the middle, fish a little bit lower mortality, poultry, and then plant sources of protein like I talked about before. And it's interesting that we get almost an identical kind of ranking as was done by the short-term studies. And this combination of evidence, even though we can't do randomized trials going on for decades, gives us a lot of confidence that this relative ranking is pretty reliable. But then there's the evidence, the issue of how much of these different sources of food might we consume. It's generally good, pretty clear to keep red meat consumption relatively low if we replace it with those healthy plant sources of protein. But there's probably some level of red meat that we could tolerate without too much trouble or minimal risk. But it's hard to draw a line when there's a pretty straight line relationship with mortality. So for that, in the Eat Lancet Commission, we use data on type 2 diabetes, where there is, again, a quite linear relationship between red meat consumption and type 2 diabetes. So where do you draw the line? There, even at this increment here, about 2 servings a week, we could see a significant increase. So we, a little bit arbitrary, took half that number, which is about 1 serving per week of red meat as the target number for red meat consumption. Ideally, we'd look at some of these things again with randomized trials, but those are exceedingly difficult to conduct, to basically keep people on assigned diets for years. One of the few randomized trials looked at overall dietary pattern, the Mediterranean dietary pattern, where they added either nuts or extra virgin olive oil compared to a low-fat diet, and saw about a 24% reduction in cardiovascular disease incidence. So this doesn't point to red meat specifically, but it is generally a more plant-based diet with added nuts or olive oil. And is consistent with, but not specific to red meat being relatively low. We went through this kind of process for all of the different food groups. I can't compress 3 years of work into 20 minutes here, but this is where what we came up with in terms of our dietary targets. For each food group, we had a target number, but also ranges, recognizing that there's variability in what people can tolerate. And we wanted to allow as much flexibility as possible. So this meant emphasizing whole grains, but with quite a bit of flexibility about the amount of grains that people consume. Most importantly is that they're whole. Potatoes, keeping them relatively low. I may come back to that if you have a question. I know Ireland is a special place for potatoes. Plenty of fruits and vegetables, and dairy, as I mentioned, is important. And there we came up with a range of 0 to 500 grams per day of dairy equivalents. That would be milk or cheese equivalents. And we picked, again, the midpoint of that range, a little bit arbitrary, and then did sensitivity analyses about how these different food groups would fit and remain within planetary boundaries. So I'll come back to that. We also did acknowledge that you can be a healthy vegan. And so dairy is not an essential part of diet, but does have nutritional value. So again, we went through the food groups, red meat, about 1 serving per week, a little more for poultry, eggs, several eggs per week. Fish has some special value for omega-3 fatty acids. So we said 2 servings per week, but emphasizing plant sources of protein, beans, soy, and nuts. Fat, there's quite a bit of flexibility about the total amount of fat, but emphasizing that most of it be unsaturated plant oils, not butter or palm oil. And small amounts of sweeteners, less than 1 soda per day equivalent. If we put that all together in a plate, about half of it by volume would be fruits and vegetables. And then again, looking at the rest of the plate by contribution to total caloric intake, emphasizing plant-based protein sources over animal sources. Now, these are a lot of numbers, but in the end, it boils down to pretty simply about 2 servings of animal source protein per day, with one of it being dairy and then the other being a little bit of red meat, poultry, eggs, and some fish. That can add quite a bit of variety and a lot of flexibility. Is this feasible? We looked at comparison to the Mediterranean, traditional Mediterranean diet, because in the 1960s, Greek men were the healthiest people in the world that we could find. And they were consuming about 35 grams per day of red meat plus poultry. The reference numbers we came up with that I showed, target numbers, come out to be about 43 grams per day. So very consistent with a traditional healthy Mediterranean diet. Of course, we did a nutrient analysis using those target numbers, and the nutrient composition actually looks very good. I would just put a little flag by B12. If one goes to lower animal source proteins, one will need to take some supplementary vitamin B12 in one way, one form or another. We then looked at the question of how much mortality might this prevent if everyone in the world shifted to these dietary targets from what their current dietary intakes were. We used 3 different modeling approaches, and they all gave pretty similar numbers of a huge benefit, somewhere between about 19 and 24% reduction in total mortality rates, which comes out to be about 11 million deaths per year preventable by shifting to this healthy dietary pattern. We then went on to look at the question of whether this dietary pattern could be sustainably produced for the world's population. For that, we used a meta-analysis of life cycle analyses, looking at different food groups. And I don't have time to go into the details, but very roughly, red meat here, looking at greenhouse gas and the yellow and the green dots. Red meat is far off the chart in terms of the greenhouse gas equivalents produced. Other animal source proteins are sort of in the middle. That includes dairy, pork, chicken, eggs, but the really low impact foods in terms of greenhouse gas production are the plant sources of food, such as nuts, roots, legumes, vegetables, fruits, and cereals. We looked at this on a country basis and regional basis. And here the point is that there's tremendous variability today around the world about what people are eating. I think that's probably obvious to pretty much anyone. So this vertical line here is there are target intake numbers, and red meat is actually lower than that in Southeast Asia, but far above that in the North America and Northern Europe as well. Poultry is high in some countries, again, quite low in others, but almost every country around the world is short in terms of fish, vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and nuts, which are all have health effects that are beneficial. To look at the issue of how this would fit within planetary boundaries, we used a modeling process conducted by our colleagues at Oxford and UK. And essentially, if, as was pointed out by Zoe, if we look at the business as usual model, we're going to far overshoot what is the greenhouse gas limit that's thought to be acceptable or viable for the food system at about 5 gigatons per year on a global basis. That we're on track to about doubling that by 2050. But if we just shifted to those dietary targets, we could stay at the limit of greenhouse gas production. And if we used improved agricultural production methods, which you just heard about some of those, and cut waste, then we could fairly readily stay within planetary boundaries for greenhouse gas production. Of course, there are other environmental impacts that we have to keep an eye on, and we need to make both that shift in diet and adopt substantial waste reduction and agricultural improvements if we're going to stay within planetary boundaries for all of those variables. Just to take a step back and look at the big picture of how do we stay within less than 2 degrees centigrade increase in global temperatures by year 2100. This gold bar here is the food system. At present, much more greenhouse gas is coming from energy production, from industry, from buildings, that's mostly heating them, and from transportation. And I should mention that this is an underestimate because transportation and energy inputs to the food system are counted here. But the basic point is that it is extremely high priority to get to green energy. And the European targets do recognize that. That's really, that's a very valuable goal. And so all of the assumptions that I've given are based on green energy almost entirely by 2050. But if we, again, continue off track in terms of the food production system, we can't stay within those planetary boundaries by 2050. But if we just shifted to those healthy dietary targets, we could. I did want to point out this huge area here that no one talked about, many people here are concerned about, but this assumes also very large amounts of sequestering of carbon from the agricultural system. And that is a critical area that needs a lot of research and examination. So I'm grateful that you are very much keeping an eye on this in your considerations. To conclude, we are in a path leading to ecological disasters in a sick and unstable global planet. But feeding 10 billion people a healthy and sustainable diet is possible. This would improve the well-being of billions of people and allow us to pass on to our children a viable planet. To do this, though, will require every country, every group, every region, really down to almost every person to be engaged in this process, because achieving this will be a huge challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Willett, for that really thought-provoking presentation. Just some questions that are coming in from the audience here. For people who don't like or eat fish and soy-based proteins, how do we convince or help them to increase their consumption of healthy proteins to increase sustainability of the diets they consume?
Well, that's a good question, a huge question, because change is always difficult. And some people have been very nihilistic and say, well, you can't really change people's behavior or what they eat. But we have seen huge changes even in the last few decades. It doesn't happen from one year to another. But we've seen, for example, in the US, red meat consumption has gone down by about 40% since 1970. Egg consumption has a similar decrease, driven to some degree, large degree, by health concerns. So it is possible. But this is an example where we need to bring other people, the culinary world aboard, the food service people aboard, chefs, to show and demonstrate that healthy and sustainable eating can be really enjoyable, satisfying. Again, it won't happen overnight, but this does need to be an area where we have to get our colleagues in other fields, and we are working a lot with colleagues in other fields to help make this shift. Just a very simple step. A study conducted in the UK showed that just putting on a menu in a food service more than one plant-based alternative option very substantially doubled the uptake. Just somebody might not like one choice, but they'll go for another. So having more variety and more options out there is a very simple way to get this started.
Okay. Another question coming in here. Is it possible to get enough macronutrients by shifting to a more plant-based diet and moving away from a traditional diet? And I guess a traditional diet in the sense of a meat-heavy, a red meat-heavy diet, I assume, is what's meant there.
Oh, absolutely. That's basically because it's much more efficient to consume the foods, the plants directly than run them through animals. That there's about a 50-to-1 inefficiency ratio for protein intake to cattle to produce beef compared to eating the protein source directly. So there's massive inefficiencies in the animal agricultural system. Dairy is considerably more efficient. It's, as I pointed out, somewhere in the middle. So if you're going to have cattle, it's definitely better to be using them for dairy production. Of course, you get some meat spinning off of that when the milk starts to dry up and the cattle get converted to hamburgers. The dairy cattle get converted to hamburger. But in general, yes, in fact, it's the only way we can really be able to feed the planet a healthy diet is to be shifting, not entirely, but more in the direction of plant-forward diet. We're using plant-forward as a description or flexitarian. Plant-based is a little bit ambiguous. Some people think it means vegan. That's not what we're talking about. If someone wants to become a vegan, they can, but there is room for a lot of variety here with some some animal source foods in it.
Okay, and I suppose a follow-up from that then is how do we model this to meet the requirements for children?
For children under 2, they're rapidly growing, and they really should be having mother's milk all through that time, ideally. Of course, not very many mothers today nurse to age 2, but that ideally from a health standpoint, that would be desirable, and then supplementing them with some food. We basically said there's a lot of controversy just about how to optimally feed children when they're weaned still today. But that's actually a very small amount of the total food production because that's a small part of the population and they're small people. So we said, just from our calculation standpoint, feed them whatever they should be fed, including if you want to feed them all milk, you could do that. But of course, they need more than that. So we really took that part out of the calculation because it's not, the conclusions are not sensitive to that. And then after a few years, they can really, the composition it's optimal for health is probably very similar for children and adults. So this works well, I think, across, beyond the age of 2 or 3.
Okay, so not for the younger cohort necessarily. Do you believe that the use of insecticides sorry, I beg your pardon. Do you believe that the use of insects as a sustainable source of protein could be a viable method in lowering our environmental impact of foods? Or do you think it would be too extreme as a dietary change?
That's an area where there's a lot of research. Of course, in some parts of the world, that's a tradition already. And it's becoming sort of a fad thing in the US. I don't know if it is in Dublin too, to have cricket pasta. I had some last year, and in fact, I couldn't tell the difference. So I think there is, there's a lot of research going on in that area. Basically, we need all the research, all the experimentation we can do. There's no single right answer, and the more variety in terms of solutions, the better. So I would encourage all of them, but evaluating all of them carefully as we go along. Eating insects directly may be useful in some places, but the insects can also play another role. In addition to ruminants, some insects can break down cellulose. And one possibility is where we have grasslands or residues, waste, that's mostly cellulose from agricultural crops, say the stems of wheat, to have insects digest those and then feed the insects to chickens. That could represent a much more efficient alternative, and being able to use some of these residues that otherwise are sometimes wasted. We should also not forget that the pathway to keeping under 2 degrees centigrade temperature increase assumes quite a bit of biofuel. Using maize or corn is not a very good way to do it, but in some places using grass, tall grasses that are special for biofuels can be part of agricultural systems as well. So again, there's no single answer. It really depends a lot on the geography, the climate, just like you're looking at Ireland, which is pointed out, optimized for grass kind of agriculture. How do we best use that? And insects as part of that picture are something to keep in mind and look at.
Okay, thank you. The range for dairy on the planetary health diet is 0 to 500 grams per day, with the example using 250 grams. How can we justify the zero value, and could the calories be kept below 2,500 if the nutrient shortfall is met by other foods? And what about elderly people and all of that too?
Yeah, the dairy question is really interesting. And I should say our families have been dairy farmers for generations. And my father did work on improving dairy production. So this is something I have lived with. And dairy is really interesting. We do see beyond 2 servings a day, we do see some increases in some cancer risk, which is why I think a higher amount is not optimal. And also it does put a lot of saturated fat in the food supply if we go higher, even at 2 servings a day. We picked, I didn't mention, we looked in a sensitivity analysis if we could, everybody consume 2 servings a day of dairy, and we couldn't stay within planetary boundaries at that level. So we stayed with the 1 serving a day, which was a little starting point. We conducted lots of sensitivity analyses to check these numbers and see whether they would stay within planetary boundaries. But in terms of zero, most of the planet does not, most of the planet's people do not consume dairy. It's most of Asia has not consumed dairy. Just in recent years, they've started to consume more. Huge parts of Africa, South America have never consumed dairy as an adult. And I did a little survey in our department a couple of years ago to just around the table, how much dairy did people consume after they were 2 years of age, and about half the department said zero. And they're professors at Harvard doing pretty well. They're a little bit shorter probably because of that, but otherwise they are, again, functioning very well. So we have culturally a huge amount of human experience. And of course, when we study vegans who don't consume dairy, if they have an otherwise healthy diet, and again, all diets can be either healthy or not healthy, depending on the quality. It's very possible to have a vegan diet with 0 dairy. We do, again, need to make sure that people get vitamin B12 from some source or another. It's something that is traditionally part of Northern European diets. It was a way to survive in cold climates. So it's natural that in North America and Northern Europe, dairy production was a survival technology.
Okay, just leading on from that, you mentioned concerns over vitamin B12 intake on a plant-based diet. So this question is from somebody who's wondering about iron. The suboptimal intake of iron by women was mentioned by a previous speaker, and I guess, how do we address that issue?
Yeah, a lot of these questions we could go on for an hour. So very briefly, iron intake, the iron deficiency is a major issue, and including in places like the US and Europe, partly because in premenopausal women, because of menstrual losses. And it's interesting that those menstrual losses are not natural. In traditional societies, women menstruated maybe once in their life, and then they were always pregnant or lactating and didn't have all that iron loss. So our losses today are sort of a result of an artificial lifestyle that, of course, we would not want to give up. We want to have our girls educated, go to college, and we can't have 15 or 20 pregnancies per person. Of course, there was a high mortality rate at that time. So I don't think we should use that need for some extra iron by premenopausal women as an excuse to eat red meat. if we do need some extra iron during that period, and if one does have a really good quality plant-based diet, one can get enough iron, and our numbers do look fine as in our nutritional analysis. But if some people do need some extra iron, it's probably better to get that as a part of a multivitamin, multimineral, which actually women are recommended to take anyway to be sure that they get enough folic acid. And so just making sure it has like an RDA of iron in it will easily make up for what might be coming from red meat. So again, I don't think that should serve the need for some extra iron during that by women in that period of life should be a reason to be taking more red meat, which increases the risk of diabetes, cardiovascular disease. There's lots of adverse consequences of high red meat consumption.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking all of those questions and for your presentation. It was really interesting. My apologies to those whose questions we didn't get around to. We're going to take a short break now, but we will be coming back in a couple of moments for the panel discussion, and we look forward to you joining us then.
Well, thank you, Helen. This is really, again, wonderful, a very important task you're undertaking, and I was honored to be part of it.
Thank you for being here with us.
Good afternoon. My name is Dolores O'Riordan. I'm a professor of food science at the School of Agriculture and Food Science, and I'm also director of the Institute of Food and Health. And it's my great pleasure to be part of this symposium here today on the very important topic of rethinking food systems. So it really has been a fascinating, just under 3 hours, listening to 6 wonderful talks, an awful lot of material to assimilate. I think we heard a lot about the challenges, but really I felt invigorated that certainly the researchers are coming up with a lot of solutions towards the great challenges that we're facing. So in this discussion group this afternoon, I'm joined by 4 speakers. And the purpose of this discussion group is to reflect on what we've heard this afternoon in terms of the 6 speakers, and perhaps to position it in terms of how does this affect Ireland? So agri-food is our largest endogenous industry. So with all the challenges we're facing, to get the expert view as to how Ireland is going to respond to this challenge. So joining us here for the discussion, we have Dr. Michelle Collins. So Michelle is Head of Nutrition and Sustainability and Innovation at Glanbia, one of our most successful multinational food companies based in Ireland and indeed with many centres abroad. And then I have 3 colleagues from the School of Agriculture and Food Science. We have Associate Professor Barry McMahon, whose expertise is in the area of agriculture and biodiversity. We have Dr. Edel Kelly, who focuses her research on innovation at farm level and right through to food products. And then our 4th panel member is Professor Tommy Boland, and he is a professor of ruminant nutrition. So I'm delighted to welcome all of the panelists. As I say, we've had an awful lot to assimilate this afternoon, a lot of it very relevant to your own expertise. But perhaps because this session is focusing on really what does it mean for Ireland, I might just start with you, Michelle, because looking at your job title, I think you're eating and breathing this every day and trying to implement a lot of the research that we're hearing about today. So perhaps tell us, what is it like on the ground with an Irish industry trying to face these challenges?
Hi, Dolores, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of the panel this afternoon. So I would say, Dolores, that indeed we are eating and breathing this topic, as you have mentioned. And one of the biggest challenges that we would see in our industry is how to sustainably contribute to food security. And that is primarily driven by what's happening in terms of population changes. And some of our speakers earlier today have alluded to the increase in population change over the next 30 years. So by 25%, that will increase. And that will put massive pressure on us as a food industry to deliver the food and the quality food and nutritious food to meet that demand. The pressure will be put on our land, our energy, and our water resources to accommodate that. But I suppose to overcome it, we're looking at research and innovation. So how do we mitigate, or how do we prepare for that onslaught of population change? So today, we're investing a lot in research and innovation, both at the farm level and right through to processing and finished product. We have the great opportunity of being custodians and of the supply chain from an end-to-end perspective. So at inputs at farm level, right up to the finished product going to our customers and consumers. We have a very balanced portfolio of dairy and plant. So we are primarily known as a dairy company. However, we have a plant portfolio, and we're expanding in that domain as others are. So it's a great opportunity for Glanbia.
And just on that, Michelle, I think, a lot of people, particularly in Ireland, would associate Glanbia as being a dairy company, being one of the largest dairy producers here. And has your move into plant protein, is that based on consumer demand, or is it deliberately, I suppose, in terms of reacting to what we're facing in terms of trying to control emissions and from an environmental point of view, or is it a combination of both together? It's the pull from the market plus the environmental issues?
Yeah, so I would say it's a bit of both, Dolores. So the pull from the market, and look, we have a plant portfolio for a number of years. It's not new to Glanbia Ireland. So, but we are leveraging that to address the changing consumer demand for veganism, flexitarianism. So we're leveraging our oat portfolio and our quinoa portfolio to address those areas. However, in terms of complete nutrition, we can't ignore our dairy business, and dairy is the cornerstone of the food industry. So we have a great opportunity there to bring the best of both worlds together, the complete nutrition from dairy and also bring together that plant-based nutrition that consumers are looking for. So you've got either or you've got the combination of both, so resulting in a hybrid product. And I think Professor Fiona Doohan this morning also, or earlier this afternoon, referred to hybrid products and the role of oats and legumes as well in sustainable diet and nutrition. So great opportunity there for us. So it is, it is also a reaction, Dolores, as you've mentioned, to environmental challenges that we face as an industry as well. So we're very cognizant of that, and obviously we've got measures in place and initiatives to address that, as others have in this space. And it's not an easy task, I would say, but certainly we're on the right journey.
Super. As I say, our first session, we kicked off with Fiona Doohan talking about plants, and that was followed by Jonathan Rushton. I noticed there was a question left unanswered in Jonathan's session, which is around how do we get ecology balance? And I noticed he thought that Barry McMahon might be able to answer that. Perhaps a hospital pass there, Barry, but you're here in the discussion panel. So over to you. How do we get that ecology balance?
Yeah, thanks very much, Dolores. and thanks to Jonathan for that. But it's great to have an opportunity to reflect on an afternoon of really thought-provoking talks and discussions. So in terms of sort of how do we redress ecological balance in relation to the food system, I think even Michelle has touched on it already. It's we need to start valuing our natural resources, and how we value our natural resources, not just value, but improve the way in which we value them. And we need to be able to sort of identify what are the key agri-environmental indicators, be they biodiversity, be it soil, water, greenhouse gases. We need to identify those. And I mean, I know we're talking about Ireland specifically, but globally there are massive challenges around greenhouse gases. And I think every single speaker referred to that. But there's another challenge in relation to the biodiversity loss that maybe the public aren't so well aware of, in terms of the amount of biomass that's been lost in the last 30 years. And it's huge levels. Like, we've lost 68% of our global biomass since 1970. And that's something that really can't be ignored. And as Fiona mentioned, like, biodiversity is really interlinked with our food production systems and the variety of our food production systems. So we need to look at that. I suppose specifically in Ireland, the EPA have just published a report on the state of the environment. And I'm not going to go in at length to the indicators there, but it's not very good reading in relation to water, in relation to say biodiversity in general, particularly in relation to farmland birds. I would say an interest of
and maybe perhaps just to bring that out a little, Barry, because I think a lot of us are under the assumption, you know, that it's the green island and we produce things really well from an environmental point of view. And as you say, I think we often miss the biodiversity piece. So maybe to highlight what are the key issues. I know you said we have this problem globally, but what is happening in Ireland, as you say, it may not have been the most glowing of reports. So maybe just to highlight what our challenges are there. Yeah.
Specifically, Dolores, I would say, like, if you're a farmland bird in Ireland, it's a challenging time, and then the vast majority of farmland bird populations are in decline. Again, you can talk about specifics like curlew or whinchat or lapwing. These are birds that are particularly whinchat and curlew would be on the brink of extinction as a breeding species in Ireland. So that's something to point out. And I mean, again, there are challenges in relation to the quality of our habitats in farmland. And we do have good areas, and this was mentioned before by some of the speakers, we do have areas of sort of non-productive habitat that is important for biodiversity, but it's the quality of that habitat that is really something that we need to look at a little bit more closely. And I suppose, you know, just to look at the challenges as well, there are ways in which we can change the way in which we value these resources that we have. And this is, I suppose, it's very easy to point out all the problems, and there are some, and if you want to look at the specifics, they are there in the report. But there are mechanisms by which we can change behavior, and we can change behavior by the way we value these resources. And there are examples of how this can be done in terms of legislation, in terms of agri-environment schemes, in terms of locally led approaches. But certainly there needs to be an increase, not just in awareness, but the way in which we treat our knowledge in terms of how actually the food system and food goes back and it impacts on our natural environment. So we need to come up with mechanisms that align the objectives of management of our natural resources in conjunction with production and in conjunction with nutritional quality. And there are others on the panel and yourself who are much better placed to speak about those elements.
And it's probably the educational aspect of it as well, that we're all realizing that this is within the environmental mix as well.
Absolutely, and it is about, a lot of the things are about behavioural change. And one of the things on a One Health discussion group that we have realised and we've pointed out is that one of the few positives of COVID is that it demonstrates how adaptable humans are. So we're able to change. We just have to enable the mechanisms to facilitate that change.
Okay, so taking that behavioural piece, I might just move to you, Edel. You chaired the second session, and within the second session, I certainly was struck with the definition that Breach McNulty gave in terms of a sustainable diet. There was an awful lot in that definition, from environmental to health to cultural acceptability. And one of the questions came in was around that education piece, and I think it's more what Barry's saying. It's a cultural piece, it's a behavioural piece. You as an educator within a third level environment, what do you think we can do in terms of education, and particularly so that the public, not just the public, but you operate at farm level, so I think we need the behavioural change from the producers right out through to the consumers to understand this concept. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, thanks, Doris. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, when both Tim and Breach spoke about sustainable diets, you can just see how complex it really is, because you have to really tackle it from a lot of different angles. And when Breach spoke about the educational piece, I mean, a question came in about at what stage should we start educating? Is it at primary school? And she was absolutely supportive of that, because it's where we start our initial, I suppose, food habits. And it is very circular. So within the family, we do pass on traditions and food habits, and we consume similar foods as we get older and grow older. So when we talk about what is a sustainable diet, we have to factor in lots of social issues, things like factoring in the cost of sustainable foods. And I mean, Tim also touched on that in our earlier panel when he showed us the Harvard food plate, and really that shows us what we should be eating. And within that, from memory, it was 50% of our diet should be in or around, consist of fruit and vegetables. But when we look at actually what we're producing, that's fruit and vegetables only represent about 17%. So we need to see a big change in what we're consuming. But it's not just as simple as to say it's one group of actors within our food system. So most definitely we can see our farmers have a role to play there. But also, you know, Tim spoke about the huge role of the private sector as well. So, you know, our consumers have a role in terms of reactions and responses. So, and also our regulators have a role in terms of actually driving policy to assist us to change as well. So when we look at consumers, and I suppose I should say my conversations with Breach and Tim were around looking at potential solutions, and they put forward a number of different areas we can improve on. And then from the nutritional side, Breach gave us lots of examples of where we need to improve in terms of like reducing our saturated fat contents in our diets, but also sugars. And then from a policy point of view, Tim kind of gave us different solutions, which were things around like the carbon tax, and education is a key role there as well. I think one of the things at farm level, which was highlighted, is I suppose our need to build resilience into the farming system. And then that's going to be a key strategy kind of going forward. So being able to cope with changes. So Barry, you kind of mentioned a couple of shocks there, climate shocks, but also COVID, and they're great examples. COVID in particular is a very good example of demonstrating how rapidly we can actually change. And also with geopolitical change, you know, I think we should consider how our future food production system is going to actually operate. So when Tim spoke about the quadrant, which looks at sustainable diets, you can look at it on a scale of kind of a free trade, very high-end commercial globalized supply chain to a very local or regional kind of supply chain. So we're consistently trying to push shorter supply chains, which reduces power within the food system. So money and power have a big role to play here, you know, and we have to accept that, and we have to try and deal with it. We can't ignore it. And money and power in terms of corporate power and what's driving that, but also money in terms of consumer spending power. So not everybody can afford the certain types of food, and there is costs associated with climate changes that we introduce at farm level, but also right through the supply chain. So at farm level, I mean, definitely agricultural technologies are going to have a role to play there in supporting farmers and trying to help them become more environmentally friendly. But Barry also touched on it there when you talk about valuing the public goods. So at farm level, we really are still not rewarding farmers for the positive production of protecting these natural resources, which are in decline, and we're still not paying farmers for that type of system. So while there are speakers earlier talking about, you know, having more diverse food palettes, which is really important, and not just from a health point of view, but also from a kind of a climate resistance perspective. So making our farms more resilient, and it's really shocking when you hear the figures, you know, that a third of our crops comes from just a handful of crops, 3 and 4 crops. So that type of monoculture within agriculture is also very risky from a disease perspective. And we need to kind of start, and that's really driven from globalization and scale. And we are obviously an exporting nation, so we're competing and global markets. And
I might just intervene there, Edel, because you talk a lot about the farmer. I think a very valid point. I mean, we talked with Barry about, you know, we need to increase our awareness and value biodiversity equally well. I think we need to value the farmer, you know, and Tim talked a lot about the price paradigm that we're facing within food. But if I could just get you to comment on one other thing that Tim brought up, I think that resonated with me, was looking to the future and seeing the importance of local markets. Now, obviously, as an island nation with a high food volume production, we will always look to our export market, but that local market is becoming increasingly important, particularly in having the shorter supply chain in terms of food provenance, in terms of authenticity, etc. So talking to the farmers and or taking the farmers' perspective there, do you have thoughts on how we could create local produce? I mean, I think a lot of people would have been fairly shocked with the figures that Fiona was presenting in terms of what we are producing in the whole crop and plant area. So where, with your expertise on the farm end of things, do you see opportunities there, or where would you see growth?
Yeah, I think actually I heard Fiona talking about that, and it really kind of resonated with me as it's a key opportunity. I mean, for us as a small island nation, the scale of our farms by comparison to our international competitors in New Zealand, Australia, States, in South America, I mean, we operate at a very, very small level. So there's a key opportunity there for, I personally believe anyway, at least for our Irish farmers. And Tim touched on it by saying, you know, local is lovely and it is great. And having, you know, small scale regenerative agriculture that is kind of circular in nature is really a massive opportunity for Irish farmers. But the challenge there, it comes from the economic side and from the kind of market side. So the question we have to ask is, well, actually, is there a ready-made market for this? And are consumers willing to pay for this? So when Fiona talked about kind of the crops, and we look at the staggering level of imports that we have of the various different crops like barley and soya and all the rest, I mean, are we willing to look at something like the development of a wholly domestically produced litre of milk, for example, you know, that's fed on Irish grain, on Irish crops, on Irish grasslands? if you look, are you costed that type of a product or a GM-free supply chain? You know, I mean, we have to engage with types of issues because they're real issues for Irish farmers. There is a cost element there to that. So I think that the markets maybe need to be assessed, and we need to look from our point of view, from Irish farmers' point of view. We are an exporting nation, but there are global markets out there who may be interested in those types of products. And if we can sell our story appropriately, we have the kind of metrics there to measure where we're at. And if we can, you know, no backsliding is something that's used from the Commission at the moment. It's a big term in the CAP reform works, that while we've made some gains, we've also, as Barry mentioned, have many failings. So we need to have, you know, we need to pull our socks up, if you like, and we need to keep ahead of our game when it comes to our environmental metrics, because it really is going to be a key selling point for our farmers if we are to go local. But there are different models. So, you know, the local food groups who need to perhaps be supported, food markets, we need to probably go back to the educational piece that you brought up initially, the importance of buying local, eating seasonal, and having lower food miles on our products. And again, there, I think the role of the private sector is important. So there needs to be kind of a systemic change in terms of our attitudes, and in terms of the private sector delivering the types of goods that are good for not just the farmer, but for society and for the health of our nation and our globe as well. So it's complicated, but I think it's very possible. It's definitely an opportunity, and it's an area that I think maybe the markets need to be assessed a little bit more.
Very good. You raised some points there that I just want to pick up with Tommy, but just to remind the audience, the discussion panel are willing to take questions as well. I think you know the show at this point, how to use the Q&A buttons. So just keep the questions coming, and we'll deal with that amid our discussions here as well. And so just to pick up on something that Edel had talked about there, Tommy, and I think it's, you know, your expertise is in the area of ruminant nutrition. And before going to, I suppose, what we heard about today in terms of the challenges of ruminant production, the discussions around I suppose the supply of food to our ruminants in terms of, can we get this closer to market feed? You know, can we have Irish produced feedstuffs? Can we have a non-GMO feedstuffs? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Dolores. And I'd like to start off by saying that it's been a really enjoyable afternoon. And one of the byproducts of COVID-19 is the fact that we can attract so many international experts into an afternoon discussion session, which really increases the scope for discussion. And you know, it opens us up to broader perspectives and broader inputs. I was just making some notes. I've made copious notes this afternoon. It'll take me a few days or a few weeks to get my head around everything I've heard. But I was making notes as Edel was talking about, you know, using local product to produce local feed. We're just in the last days of a study on a research farm out in Lyons, where we've used essentially cereal grains grown in Kildare to finish our animals, our beef cattle, which have been grown on multi-species swards that have low fertilizer nitrogen inputs, which are good from a biodiversity perspective, which are good from a reducing emissions perspective. And I'm lucky to be involved with that work with Dr. Helen Sheridan, who chaired the last session, and Helen has pioneered this work from an Irish context. So there are opportunities there, and we can certainly look at producing these products with locally sourced feed inputs, minimizing the requirement for chemical inputs, let that be fertilizer, nitrogen, or medicines to support animal health. And you know, we would like to think, at least at this stage, that there may even be economic benefits to the producer from that perspective. But there is a huge task of work at hand to translate that message to farm level. And the systems that are utilized in Ireland at the moment, they're not there by chance. They're being utilized because they work very well under our conditions, and they are a product of the food system. And you know, I was listening with interest to Barry's summation of the farm bird populations in Ireland, and I can recall, and my father telling me stories of, you know, the corncrake when he was a kid, and how they used to mow the hay in a particular fashion to give the corncrake the best chance of surviving the mowing process. And the change in management practice at farm level have, at least in part, been a response to the change in the food system globally, which has driven a demand and a requirement for farmers to produce food and inputs into the food system for ever reducing margins and ever reducing costs. So I think farmers have arrived at where they are, and after this call, I'm going to talk to a group of farmers in East Donegal who want to learn more about our work with multi-species swords, because they want to improve the sustainability of their farming systems in Donegal. So, you know, farmers are hungry for information here, and you know, it's partly our responsibility as a third level education body to provide them with that information. But we shouldn't underestimate the ability for the farming population to respond, but they need to get clear signals and clear direction and clear guidelines as to how to respond and what that response will mean for them, because they are looking at this from a whole range of perspectives, including an economic perspective.
Okay. And just quickly, I mean, we heard from Zoe in the third session the good progress you're making in terms of reducing emissions on the farm and the various interventions that are there. But I suppose listening to Professor Willard in terms of a comment, you know, a lot of the world don't eat dairy. It didn't seem to be up there in terms of being highly recommended as part of a healthy diet. It's part of it, but you know, not probably at the levels we would consume in Ireland. Not consistent with what the diet healthy guidelines would be in Ireland at the moment. So the future of dairy in Ireland, you've about 30 seconds for that now, Tommy. But
well, I was getting a bit worried during Professor Willett's presentation. I might only have 30 seconds left in my career as a reader. You know, we produce a lot of dairy product, we produce a lot of beef, and the reason we produce them is there's a global demand for them. You know, the majority of the dairy product and the beef we produce in Ireland is exported to international markets. We do it quite well, and I suppose I would disagree with some of the statistics that were quoted about the low efficiency in beef production systems in terms of conversion of protein. You know, one of the things in our production systems from a beef perspective and from a dairy perspective is that the systems produce more animal edible or human edible protein than they actually consume. So there is an upcycling benefit to feeding things like grass and byproducts from the tillage industry to ruminants, and they enhance the quality of those products, and they utilize that cellulose. And the Professor will have mentioned the potential of insects there as well. I think that's probably years, if not decades down the line in an Irish context, why we do have the systems in place with our dairy and beef systems to upcycle those lower grade nutrients from a human diet point of view into quite high quality amino acids and micronutrients.
That's great, Tommy. I think we could spend hours discussing that last topic there. I don't have time to take the questions from the floor, but there is one that I think is a challenge, just that I might throw back to you, Michelle, as we come to a close. It's around, are we over extrapolating human behavior from COVID? And I suppose it's back to, there is big behavioral change to happen. You're dealing with consumers on a daily basis. So back to that behavioral piece. So as a company, how are you addressing that challenge? Tommy talks about, he sees, you know, insect protein being down a long way down the line. So I suppose your thoughts from a Glanbia perspective on that. You're muted there, Michelle.
Sorry, certainly COVID has influenced people's thinking in terms of their health and well-being and the nutrition that they eat. And even that local story of sourcing local has really gained precedence during COVID as well. In terms of how are we addressing that, so we're looking at it in terms of a portfolio perspective. So what are the needs from a consumer perspective? You know, what are their health and nutrition needs? And do we have a portfolio that can address those needs? And if we don't, then how can we innovate to provide that choice to consumers? So look, we have a domestic market here in Ireland, and we also have an international market as well, where BDB and BDC it's a broad portfolio that we have control of, and we certainly have within our domestic market, you know, a value-added milk portfolio that is that can address some of the concerns that are coming through from COVID in terms of nutrition and immunity, and overall well-being. So we can't ignore it. It is certainly a trend that will not be going away over the next couple of years, and it would be remiss of us if we didn't address it through innovation, Dolores, and that's from a product perspective. But then you've also got the farm perspective as well. So we're constantly innovating there. You know, Tommy and Barry have talked to some of you know, their areas of expertise, and we're embracing them in our organisation as well. Today we've launched the Operation Biodiversity from a Glanbia Ireland perspective. So so Barry, that might be of interest to yourself to have a look at that and see what that means. But COVID-19 certainly has changed consumers' behaviour and thoughts. And again, in the world that we're in, Dolores, there's constant change, you know, from consumers. So they're constantly demanding more, to know more about their food, their traceability, how their food is produced, and what's in their food as well as looking for that complete nutrition.
Okay, that's wonderful. We've gone 2 minutes over, so we need to bring the discussion to a close. As I say, I think we could be here for hours. There's so much to discuss. It's been a fascinating afternoon. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you to all of the panelists for your input here. And thanks particularly to the organisers for an absolutely wonderful afternoon. So just remains for me to pass back to Professor Lorraine Brennan at this point. Over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you very much, Dolores. So I'm just going to say a few words before we can close the symposium. So I really enjoyed this afternoon, and I really hope that you did too. I've certainly learned a lot from it. Without doubt, we have huge issues, but it's with sessions like this that we can really make steps forward, and we can make a change, hopefully, for the better in the future. So with that, I would like to thank all our speakers for sharing their work, their thoughts, and their with us this afternoon. I'd like to thank the chairs, the panel members, and Alex as head of school for supporting us in bringing around this symposium. And of course, finally, I'd like to thank the audience for supplying us with a huge amount of questions throughout the day. I apologize that we didn't get to address them all or answer them all, but really without an audience and without an interactive audience, this would not have been a success. So thank you all very much. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors. They were the EPA and the Institute of Food and Health, and all of those who are in the background organizing. So Alex thanked them at the beginning, and I'd like to acknowledge and thank them again at the end. So finally, I really hope that we'll be able to invite you all in 2 years' time onto the campus in UCD for a follow-up session on something, and hopefully we will have moved a little bit towards transforming our food systems. So thank you all again.